Chapter 8. The End of the 60s. Time to Move On. 1969. When one looks back on it now, after 2 years on the air, Radio 1 had a team of very good DJs whose appeal covered the widest range of music. Tony Blackburn, Jimmy Young, Dave Cash, Terry Wogan, John Peel, David Simons, Keith Skews, Tony Brandon, Johnny Walker, Kenny Everett, Ed Stewart, Emperor Roscoe, Stuart Henry, Johnny Moran, Simon D., Chris Denning, Dave Lee Travis, Jimmy Savile, Alan Freeman, Noel Edmonds and Anne Nightingale. It was a regular who's who of popular British music radio. Anne Nightingale was the first female DJ on the station, and you may wonder why it had taken so long for a woman to appear. Truth to tell, we probably were sexist, and broadcasting was something which us chaps did. There was another reason. Apart from Jean Metcalfe on Two-Way Family Favourites, there had been few role models. It was very much a male-dominated job. Most women who tried it sounded arch or contrived, and it wasn't until Annie came along with her journalistic background and extensive knowledge of the subject that a girl received a break. Once she did, others soon followed, but it was a few years before the women really had equal opportunities on Radio 1. In the early 70s, Radio 1's biggest problems were the lack of separation from Radio 2 and the need for more needle time. If it could have overcome those, bearing in mind the quality of the DJs, Radio 1 would have grown much bigger much sooner. Radio 1 was still only separate for 62 hours a week, hardly enough to establish itself as a full-blown radio station. This was at the end of the swinging 60s, yet we were still not a full-time swinging station. Added to this, we had failed to get any increase in needle time, which in total amounted to just over 80 hours a week in total for all of radios 1, 2, 3 and 4. Radio 1 only had 35 hours. It wasn't the done thing to make programmes for other stations, but somehow in mid-1969 I sold an idea from Keith Skews and myself which was a natural for Radio 2. Because of our RAF background, we wanted to make the music of the few. We had sold Douglas Muggeridge this idea to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. There was a major cinema film released to mark the occasion, and our idea was to track down former pilots who'd taken part in the battle and talk to them about their wartime experiences and ask them to choose an appropriate piece of music. Some of the former pilots had moved abroad. Many of them had come from the Commonwealth, so we were anxious to go to the States and Canada to find them. Keith was friendly with Air Commodore Peter Brothers, who headed up the RAF Public Relations Department. Peter was a former Battle of Britain pilot himself, and when we explained the programme idea to him, he offered us travel on the regular RAF service flight from RAF Brize Norton to Washington. "Yes," said my BBC boss, "you can go, but it mustn't cost too much money." So it was that soon afterwards we found ourselves in the New York YMCA. No, we didn't dress up like the chaps in the pop video. You have to understand that Keith and I were very naive and knew nothing about the gay scene which went on there. Keith was actually feeling a bit rough with a cold, so he decided on an early night. I was so high on adrenaline and jet lag and so excited to see all those legendary places in New York that I walked for hours, taking in Broadway, Radio City, the Empire State Building and so on. It was very late when I got back to find a most upset Skews. It seemed that all sorts of gay young men, seeing he was alone, had been banging on his door all night, offering to show him a good time in the Turkish baths. They were only trying to make a stranger welcome, but as neither of us is of that persuasion, we moved out next day. From New York we travelled by Greyhound bus up through Vermont to Montreal and Toronto to find our missing pilots. One of these was Senator Hartland Molson, owner of one of the largest breweries in Canada. Another was Group Captain Gordon McGregor, both of whom had good stories to tell. The programme went out on Saturday, September the 13th, and it was a humbling experience to meet and talk to these brave and to some extent lucky survivors. I was grateful the BBC had given me the opportunity. It certainly put Radio 1 Club problems into perspective. As we moved into the 70s, we were gradually gaining more of a musical identity for Radio 1. Much of the specialist music had been hived off to Radio 2. Jazz, country and traditional forms of folk all had their own programmes. Because of this, we were very gradually establishing a reputation for more credible live and recorded music. Flower power was moving aside to make way for rock and heavy metal. John Peel was championing Mark Bolan and his Tyrannosaurus Rex, David Bowie, Elton John, Fleetwood Mac, Soft Machine, Procol Harum, Family, Chicken Shack and Free. John didn't do his reputation any good, though, when on several occasions he made appearances as presenter of Top of the Pops. So-called progressive rock by bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Colosseum and Black Sabbath was heard regularly on Sounds of the 70s, and on the contemporary folk programme we had the Strawbs, Fairport Convention and Magna Carta. We broadcast in concert regularly, where for an hour every week a major band of the day performed as live. Tony Wilson and Jeff Griffin established themselves as outstanding producers of live music. Experience for them and their studio managers which was to be invaluable years later on the really big show Live Aid. As we moved into 1971 there was yet more separation from Radio 2. Jimmy Young's morning show, which had previously been heard on both networks, was now on Radio 1 only. This move didn't please everyone, as in those days Radio 2 went out on 1500 metres on the long wave, where it could be heard on the continent and by the British forces in Germany. The BBC was bombarded with complaints requesting the restoration of Our Jim, but to no avail. Another person who generated a complaint was Dave Lee Travis. He was on the air on Palm Sunday, the week before Easter, and read out a parody of the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." In Dave's version, "The Union is my shepherd, and I shall not work," and he continued in this vein, which annoyed both the Christians and the trade unionists in his audience and led to a forced eating of Easter humble pie, a change from all those chocolate eggs. The Marine Offences Act finally saw off the last of the illegal opposition, and in 1968 Radio Caroline closed down. As a result, one of the bitterest opponents of Radio 1, Johnny Walker, was forced to come ashore. He was a very good DJ and would undoubtedly be an asset to Radio 1 and give it more credibility, but the BBC couldn't be seen to take him fresh off the boat, so he had a year on holiday leave. It was 1969 before new controller Douglas Muggeridge agreed to hire him to present a slot on Saturday afternoons. He started this in September, and with his uncompromising selection of music, John soon had a big fan following. There were many of his former fans, though, who were disappointed that he had to include studio sessions in his new show. I don't want you to go away with the idea that Radio 1 was all stripped programmes. Broadly, the pop-influenced output was broadcast in daytime hours, while in the evenings and for part of the weekends we concentrated on more specialist music. There was a logic about this, as the younger elements of the audience were only available outside school and work hours. There were some very innovative programmes too. John Peel took a holiday in early 1970, and producer John Waters proved to be very imaginative in his choice of a replacement. He picked Viv Stanshall, leader of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. John and Viv hauled in several other extroverts, including Keith Moon, to perform a series of zany sketches and provide musical interludes. It was very funny and very entertaining. Another major development was the addition of 2 hours of VHF stereo airtime from 10 till midnight for Sounds of the 70s. This was taken away from Radio 2 for weekday evenings and given to us, which enabled our listeners to enjoy a little of their music in decent interference-free quality. Each evening had a different presenter, and one of those became a well-respected figure, Whispering Bob Harris. There's no truth in the rumour that Bob was the one who hung 2 tea bags over his ears while whistling along to his records. When asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm conducting the Earl Grey whistle test." Sorry, that must be Tony Blackburn's influence. This was at the time when in Britain we were changing over from pounds, shillings and pence to decimal currency. It didn't matter what the currency was, but money of a different kind was the subject of a major exposure in the news of the world. I suppose with all the interest in Radio 1, it was inevitable that at some time a smart reporter would see if he could dig up some dirt and write up a scandal. That's what sells papers. This story concerned possible payola and sexual favours in return for plays of records on Radio 1. The first one appeared on St. Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 1970. Researching it, 2 reporters, Clive Cook and Trevor Kempson, had posed as record producers and had taken various radio producers for lunch in order to find out how they could get their records played on air. In the first article, they accused various producers and DJs of taking holidays, cash, and sexual favours in return for plays. The following week, they went on to make allegations about a photographer with Top of the Pops and some of the TV music show producers. It was written very large at the time. It caused lots of anguish and heartache. A Sergeant Penrose from Scotland Yard was put onto the case. He interviewed all the staff looking for evidence of malpractice, but in the end concluded that things were pretty straight. While there was undoubtedly some smoke, there was never a major fire, and after the Director of Public Prosecutions had examined all the evidence, no prosecutions were made, and no BBC person lost his job. What the whole episode did was remind producers and DJs of the need to select music on the basis of talent and entertainment value, and to be very careful with whom they had lunch. In my whole career at the BBC, I was never once offered any sort of bribe or inducement. Years later, I repeatedly reminded the producers working for me, never do anything in association with a record promoter or agent that could be misconstrued or written up in one of the tabloids. That way we will keep the network safe. Well, I believe it worked, because there was never another whiff of suspicion until the Savile scandal erupted, and that was years later. Chapter 9. The Beatles Story. In October 1971, Mark White called me into his office for a chat, the consequences of which were going to have a big impact on my life. "Johnny, we have a word that an American company, Watermark, are putting together the definitive Elvis Presley story based on the recent book by Jerry Hopkins. We've decided to buy it, and we'd like you to work with Watermark, the production company, take out the commercial breaks and edit it so that it's suitable for BBC transmission." A job that was right up my street, and I was thrilled to be offered it. "But that's not all," Mark went on. "We also have the word that Watermark's next project is going to be the Beatles story, and we can't possibly have an American company make a series about Britain's biggest band, so we're proposing that the BBC should do it. We wondered if you'd like to take charge of the project. If so, we want the first programme to be ready by March 1972. Well, luckily for me, he later relaxed this deadline a little, and the series finally started going out on May the 21st that year. It was a fantastic opportunity, but it meant that I had to drop all my other commitments and get stuck in right away. It's hard to imagine how big the Beatles were in the 1970s and what a huge task it was to document their story. The first major problem was that despite the prestige of the BBC being behind the project, they'd experienced so much overexposure at the hands of the media that there appeared no chance the Beatles would give us official cooperation. It would all have to be done by tracking down and interviewing all those involved with the story. To support their tales, we'd need to find as much existing Beatle interview material as we could. The BBC archives, of course, had retained most of the formal appearances, but there was a lot more unofficial stuff to find. All of this would need to be assembled in chronological order. Only when I had all of this could I start to think about the outline of the 12 one-hour episodes and consider a scriptwriter and narrator. One last problem was the story, of course, had not ended. As long as they were still alive, anything John, Paul, George or Ringo did was news. So, with my assistant Jane Paramore, I set to work. The first thing to do was to read every book ever written about the group and draw up a list of significant people I would need to interview. The Beatles' Apple organisation was crucial and luckily offered their full cooperation. They gave me a couple of private publications listing all the recording and performance activities of the group. Hunter Davis' biography, The Beatles, provided a wonderful overview, and then there were many, many articles to investigate. About 4 weeks reading to start with, and I'd completed that work by Christmas. I compiled a list which was about 150 people who I thought would be useful to talk to. On January the 10th, Jane and I were off up the M6 through the fog to Liverpool to start finding early friends and relations. It didn't prove to be easy. In my diary I wrote, "Phoned Bob Wooler, the former Cavan compere, who couldn't see us till Thursday. He had prepared a list a mile long of everyone he thought we should interview. Met up with Frida Kelly, who was their fan club secretary. Tuesday, January the 11th. We met Mrs. Best, the mother of Pete Best, but she had the flu and would only think about giving us an interview. returned to Frida Kelly, who told us that everyone she had approached on our behalf, George's parents, Ringo's parents, and the McCartneys, were unwilling to cooperate. Tried to get George Harrison, a journalist with Liverpool Echo, but failed. But did finally make contact with Clive Epstein, Brian's brother, but he and his mother couldn't see us for a day or two. At the end of that first day I managed to get an interview with Rory Storm's mum, Irene Caldwell. She turned out to be quite a character. And so it went on. Gradually I managed to record significant people like Alan Williams. Alan had promoted the very first concerts, and he and Bob Wooler had been a key part of the Cavern Club. Alan, acting as the earliest sort of manager, told them they had to get a drummer, so they found one, a chap called Tommy Moore. He told me one day Tommy didn't show up for one of the gigs, and Alan had booked them in at the Grosvenor Ballroom in Wallasey. So he went to Tommy's house, and Tommy's wife stuck her head out of the upstairs window and shouted at Alan, "I'm fed up with all this pop nonsense. Tommy's got a job on the night shift at Garston Bottleworks, so he can piss off." So Alan went to the Bottleworks and found Tommy, who said, "Well, it's the missus. She won't have it. So I've got to get a job and I can't drum any more." With Tommy out, they took on Pete Best, the son of the lady who owned a club they played in. It was Alan Williams who went over to Hamburg with his homemade tape recordings of the boys, trying to get them work. He sold the idea to Bruno Koschmieder, asking for a fee of £100 a week for the band and £10 commission for Alan. It was a fortune for the boys who'd been lucky to get 10 bob, that's 50p today a night, for their UK gigs. What they didn't realise, of course, was that they would be expected to play from 7 p.m. till 2 or 3 in the morning every single night. Having achieved limited success in Germany, Alan approached prop promoter Larry Parnes to get them a booking on a British tour, and Larry told me how the Silver Beatles, as they were then called, were always hard up. He said, "One day John comes on the phone, 'Larry, where's the bloody money? We're broke, we're skint.' I said, 'But you haven't worked this week out yet, John. In fact, you haven't even started the week.' And John said, 'I know, but you said if we got short we could have a sub.' So I said, 'How much do you want?' £5 each," said John, and every week after that he would be on, acting as a spokesman, always asking, "Where's the bloody money?" So it went on. I'd collected some good stories during our first week in Liverpool and was ready to go back to London. Next stop was Hamburg, Germany. I went there at the end of January, and it was like an overblown Soho. I didn't know which way to look. Neon signs flashing, girls in provocative costumes posing in the doorways, and clubs with music blaring out of every building, all the way along the Reeperbahn. The people there, though, were much more cooperative and open than those in Liverpool. I recorded Klaus Willerhaus, the local concert promoter, and his associate Frank Dostel, Manfred Wiesleider of the Star Club, and Tony Sheridan, who'd been a singer in the Silver Beatles. Tony told me how the Beatles had lived in an attic, and there was a little old German lady whose job it was to bring up a bucket of hot water once a day for us to wash in, and how they collected war memorabilia, badges, swastikas and uniforms, and John would dress up in them and give her all sorts of grief. The group would use these props on stage, doing outrageous things to gain attention. They would call the audience Nazi swine and other names in an effort to be different. Having got as much information as I could, in the words used by all News of the World reporters, I made my excuses and left, feeling I had achieved my objectives in Germany. In February, back in the UK, I tracked down a rare 30-minute interview with Brian Epstein. Music recordings of the Silver Beatles singing Lucille in Hamburg. Rare recordings in the Cavern when Ringo first played drums in public. That was with the Beatles. I met up with Neil Aspinall, who runs the Apple office, and Tony King, who knows everyone who is anyone. The list was building, and it was frightening just how many people I needed to talk to in such a short time in order to understand the complete picture. In mid-February I set off for America, and first stop was New York. I had a very good reception there, great fun running around the corporate offices, and people were very cooperative. One of the first people I spoke to was Sid Bernstein. He'd put on the Shea Stadium concerts. Then Murray the K, a DJ on WABC, who championed their records. And I even managed to see television star Ed Sullivan. Perhaps the scariest incident was meeting Alan Klein. I went along there one evening, and I was left in no doubt that I was in the company of a very heavy player, not a man to fool around with. If you want a good description of him, just listen to the Beatles recording of Come Together. John wrote it all about Alan Klein. It's all in there. No small talk, just ask your questions, and if I like them I'll answer. If not, tough. In the end, Alan and I didn't fall out. He gave me some useful answers about the business side and all the problems associated with the split between the members of the group. I don't intend to retell the Beatles story here. Too much has been written on that subject, but over 90 hours of tape were collected. A good thing about a group as popular as the Beatles is that they have been interviewed so many times. Once you have assembled a comprehensive library, you can find their answers and comments on almost any topic. My job was akin to solving an enormous jigsaw puzzle, fitting all the pieces together. It was an enormous amount of work, but with help from my assistant Jane we managed it. We sorted out all the possible comments and quotes into chronological sequences and edited the relevant pieces. Then came the question of who should write the story. I considered all sorts of experts, but decided that after all the research I had the best and most comprehensive knowledge of the material, so I wrote it myself. I had to choose a narrator, and there was only one broadcaster who had experienced it all and lived through it. He was Brian Matthew. When he had been on Saturday Club, he had worked with the Beatles on numerous occasions and had even been to America on tour with them. It was a pleasure putting the shows together with him, and he often chipped in little suggestions and rewrites of my original script, which made it read better. And the announcer was another old chum chosen for his superb voice and wonderful diction, Alan Dell. Finally, the opening programme was finished in time for the first transmission. The BBC lashed out on some twiglets and cheap red wine at a press launch, and even the staff magazine Ariel came and wrote a special feature. Our work wasn't done because there were still another 12 episodes to record, but we knew where we were going. The broadcast finally started transmission at 5 p.m. on Sunday the 21st of May 1972 on both Radios 1 and 2, and we had a full colour cover and feature in the Radio Times. It was pretty well received in the press, with one exception. I was hurt by Gillian Reynolds' criticisms in the Daily Telegraph. I respected her as a wide journalist who knew a lot about radio, but she was a Liverpudlian and hated the series and didn't have a good word to say about it. I suppose she was expecting a more intellectual and analytical approach to a subject she regarded as her own, whereas I had adopted a populist storytelling one. I was sorry she had not enjoyed it, but millions did. The Beatles story became one of the BBC Transcription Service's biggest ever sellers. It was broadcast in nearly every English-speaking territory in the world and was even translated into Spanish in a version for South America. I finished the series, and when it was repeated in the summer of 1973, I had to update Programme 13 and write a new Episode 14 to conclude the story. Paul McCartney had heard it by then and was very complimentary. He said, "I thought it was incredible, actually, because half the things you heard in there I just didn't know. You heard what this publisher thought and what that manager thought. It's interesting, and I'm glad it was all encapsulated like that. It helped me, because that was it. But it's finished now, folks. That's why it couldn't start up again. It's been done. The obituary's been written, and it's been laid to rest. Beatles R.I.P. And now, long live the individuals." Well, by then I'd been promoted to a position of executive producer, so my workload was changing, and we would go on at the BBC to make many more stories of. I'd started a new trend for home-produced popular music documentaries on Radio 1. I had set a standard, and it was all up to the other producers working for me to carry on that tradition of telling stories which would explain more about the music we played on Radio 1. Over the years we made many such stories: the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, Simon and Garfunkel, and many others, culminating in 26 parts of the complete story of pop. Chapter 10. The Radio 1 Roadshow. I spoke earlier about the rejigged Radio 1 Club, which had been moved from lunch to tea times, but by 1973 that too was becoming tired. It had been a useful concept to help the audience meet us, and now we needed an idea to replace it. By now I'd been promoted to executive producer, so I was in a position to put forward ideas. Indeed, that was part of my job. In the summer of 1972 I was on a camping holiday with my wife and the children near Cap d'Agde in the south of France, and while there I noticed the site on which we were staying had been taken over for the day by a sponsor who was staging all kinds of sporting activities. In the evening a mobile stage was set up, and as dusk approached people strolled towards it carrying their little aluminium chairs. Well, being a nosy sort of bloke, I wanted to see what was going on. There was to be an audience participation show, which turned out to be staged under the auspices of Radio Monte Carlo. There were a couple of big trucks and a stage in front of one of them. I watched with a professional interest as the evening wore on, and we were treated to a sort of cross between a small-scale Sunday night at the London Palladium, with cabaret acts and live musicians interspersed with all kinds of audience participation games. I found out the show was recorded and edited for subsequent transmission on Radio Monte Carlo. As we drove back across France, I started wondering whether such an idea was adaptable for Radio 1. Of course, we couldn't guarantee the same weather as in France, and as far as I knew, the BBC didn't have any suitable vehicles. But on the other hand, if I could make it work, we could go anywhere, and we wouldn't be confined to indoor locations. I talked it over with Derek Chinnery and the other executive producers, who encouraged me to make a few inquiries regarding finding a vehicle. BBC Children's Television proved to be a non-starter, and it looked as if we were going nowhere. I brought up my idea at a meeting of the regional producers involved in Radio 1 Club and explained the difficulty. Brian Patton, our man in Bristol, said he knew the manager of Adge Cutler and the Wurzels, and he thought that he owned a Pantechnicon van which they used for staging the band at country fairs. The manager's name was John Miles. I called John and arranged for producer Stuart Grundy and myself to go and see him. John made us very welcome in his Bristol home, and I outlined what I was looking for. "Sorry," said John, "I did have such a vehicle, but it's long gone." We looked rather crestfallen, but bucked up when John went on, "However, I like the idea of what you've got in mind, and I reckon it'll work. I'm a businessman as well as a manager, so how would it be if I built the vehicle that you want and hired it to the BBC? My brother Tony and I have got a body repair business, so we could build it, and Tony would be able to drive it from site to site." We were in business, the birth of what I called the Radio 1 Roadshow. Soon after that, the word roadshow seemed to enter the English language. John sent for Tony, and we sat around all afternoon sketching out the sort of thing we needed, and between us came up with the notion of a large caravan which would contain the panels for a portable stage, the whole thing to be towed by a Range Rover. We put a stable door in the side, and with a little support from BBC Records we could sell their discs, as well as Radio 1 T-shirts, posters, stickers, and a DJ magazine while the show was being staged. I believe we settled on a fee of £100 per day for the hire of the caravan and Tony's services to tow it. I was a motor racing fan and stole the idea of school uniform from there. I'd seen how racing teams were consistent in their branding, and I wanted everyone at Radio 1 to look like part of a team. So we had an anorak design based on those worn by racing drivers. It was in red, white and blue. We embroidered the Radio 1 logo very large on the back and the owner's name on the front. These jackets, coupled with specially designed T-shirts and blue jeans, made everyone look the part. What part, you may ask? Ice cream salesman, some said, and there was a lot of mickey-taking behind my back about the ice cream jackets, but most staff were quite proud to wear them. In time, the designs led to the production of a wide range of Radio 1 branded merchandise which would be sold to promote the station. It took several months to organise everything. Jobsworth attitudes had to be overcome again, as it was pretty revolutionary to have a non-BBC vehicle which would carry BBC engineering outside broadcast equipment on board. More arguments. Who will insure it? What security will it have overnights? Who's responsible for erecting the stage and the display boards and so on? Eventually these were overcome, and one warm sunny day we drove down with Alan Fluff Freeman for a dummy run in an old aircraft hangar near Bristol. It all worked rather well. The DJ desk was an adaptation of an old Radio 1 Club one. 4 orange loudspeakers provided adequate public address in that small environment, and we had some simple display panels with slots in which to drop the name of the DJ and some more panels on the side of the stage to show how many miles we had travelled between each site. The main problem arose after all the equipment and stage panels had been packed away and we'd gone. Tony Miles tried to tow it. The vehicle was only 18 feet long, and inside, in addition to the heavy loudspeakers and the broadcasting equipment, there were 4 steel-framed panels and supports that made up the stage. Tony and John had neglected to tell us that Tony had no experience of towing a caravan and knew nothing of the need to ensure even weight distribution. Consequently, when he set off down the road, the vehicle developed the most amazing wiggle. While that would have looked good on Marilyn Monroe, on a trailer it nearly caused him to lose control, and a crash would have destroyed our launch, which was scheduled for the following Monday, July the 23rd, in Newquay. I didn't learn till years later that Tony nearly broke down under the strain and responsibility. He rang his brother John, near to tears. "I don't know how I'm going to cope." Between them they made a few phone calls to more experienced caravan owners and found that by inflating the tyres and adjusting the weight distribution it was just about drivable. Even so, it took him 9 hours to get from Bristol to Newquay in Cornwall, where Tony arrived on the Sunday evening. It was very late when he arrived, and there had been some sort of mix-up over the secure parking arrangements. Tony decided to park on the broadcast site and sleep in the Range Rover so as to be ready early next morning. Unfortunately, he was not aware of the level of interest the Roadshow was going to attract, so for most of the night he was disturbed by drunken fans who wanted to know what was going on and when. If that wasn't enough, there were other interruptions from the local constabulary who wanted to know what Tony was doing parked on the beach. I'd gone back to London in the meantime to be greeted by a very sceptical Derek Chinnery. "I hope you know what you're doing. You've committed the Mars brothers to spending all that money. The weather could be awful, people might turn up, we don't know if it's going to work, and if it does, you might have your broadcast disrupted by drunken mods or rockers." That was the gist of his message. He might be right. How was I to know? I was somewhat apprehensive as Fluff and I set off that Sunday on our way to Newquay. We all gathered in the hotel. That was Fluff and me, Brian Patton and his secretary Margaret Bradley, Leo Field, Jerry Glancy, Tony Holland and Alan Harris, the outside broadcast engineers, a young lady hired by BBC Records to sell their wares, but no sign of Tony Miles, who was of course still on the road. We had a few drinks and were, as you can imagine, excited but worried about the lack of driver Miles. He phoned to say he was on his way, though delayed, and assured us he would be there, so we went off to bed pretty happy. We weren't due on air until 5 p.m, so there seemed to be plenty of time after breakfast to sight the Roadshow and set everything up. We soon hit the first snag. We were going to draw mains power for our equipment from a cafe next door to the beach. After all, they were going to benefit from the crowd we expected to draw. The snag was that Alan Harris had not calculated how long a mains cable we'd need, and he didn't have enough cable. "No problem, we'll go to the local electricity board and buy a longer one." When we got there and explained what we wanted, we were met by another job's worth. "You can't just order a piece of cable for the BBC down here without a proper order form. You need that on BBC-edited notepaper." It was another rush back to find Brian's secretary, Margaret, who fortunately carried BBC Bristol notepaper, and after she had duly typed the order, we were sold our 100-yard cable. By now it was lunchtime and luckily a sunny day, so the locals and holidaymakers lazed on the sand dunes, drinking scrumpy cider and shouting encouragement to our sweating gang. It was all good-natured, they loved Fluff anyway, and at 4 o'clock we had a good crowd ready to be warmed up by some off-air entertainment. I took the opportunity to introduce everyone and started what later became the producer's tradition, the warm-up. All the crew were involved. Tony Miles proved to be the biggest extrovert, and as it was not being broadcast we could be quite outrageous. It gave everyone a chance to see the DJ playing the fool, and we took the opportunity through our audience games to size up potential contestants for our daily quiz, Bits and Pieces, and the mileage game. The show itself went off without a hitch, and at 7 p.m. those of us involved with the broadcast were able to relax. Fluff stayed sitting on the front of the stage, signing autographs for an hour, but after he had finished, we encountered our second big snag. In our schedule, we'd not allowed for the length of time it would take Alan Harris and his colleagues to de-rig everything, Tony and crew to dismantle the stage and pack it all away. This meant it was nearly 9 p.m. before they were ready to drive off into the night to get to the next venue. For that first tour I'd settled on a tour around the entire coastline of the UK in 6 weeks. Luckily that year we were only on the air for 4 days a week from Monday to Thursday, and with hindsight it's clear it was a ridiculous schedule, and it meant sometimes the vehicles didn't get to the next town till 3 in the morning. By that time Tony and his mate were too late for dinner, and naturally all the council workers who were to organise secure overnight parking had long gone home. On top of that, the rigging had to start all over again after breakfast next morning. I don't know how they did it. Luckily there were no demarcation disputes on that first series. Everyone pitched in, the weather was good, and each DJ and production team worked the various venues together for a week, Monday to Thursday. Once we got into it, everyone had a ball. Tony was the life and soul of the party. The main problem that arose was over the sponsorship by BBC Records. Selling things out of the side of the van while we were trying to broadcast wasn't practical. The sales girl was basically no good at her job, stock control was non-existent and cash went missing, so she was fired, and Tony Miles was asked by BBC Records to try and restore commercial order. Apart from this hitch on the commercial side, it was pretty clear it was going to be a success. The majority of people attending were from a wide age group. Young people predominantly, but also many families too, a happy crowd by and large. And as the years went on, we found whole families who were such fans they would book their holidays around the locations of a favourite DJ so that they could follow him every day. At the end of the series we had a post-mortem, and Tony made a suggestion to BBC Enterprises. Next year, why don't you license my brother and me to sell a range of Radio 1 merchandise? I'll provide a separate vehicle to do it in, and the extra staff will be useful all round. There had been some rumblings of trouble from BBC Transport about the legality or otherwise of the weight load Tony was towing, so we needed a second vehicle to carry some of the heavier equipment. Tony's proposal was both logical and practical, and could only benefit all concerned in that the BBC would earn a good royalty, while Tony and John Miles would stand the capital cost of providing the second vehicle. It was agreed. What would we call it, though? The answer came from Tony Fish. Tony was an engineer who'd been involved with the wireless workshop and making Radio 1 promotions and commercials to play to the crowd. Much later on he became manager of BBC Radio York, but he must take the credit for the name, the Radio 1 Goody Mobile, which he says came to him one morning while sitting on the loo. Sadly, Tony died in 2005, so he'll never know of this claim to goody fame. When the first series ended, we took on board the lessons we had learned. The public had taken to the show, listening figures were good, and Derek was reassured. We were set for another tour. In year 2, 1974, we started the tradition of a Roadshow log, to which anyone could contribute. The weather that year was not very settled, yet despite numerous downpours, the crowds came in increasing numbers. As the school holidays started earlier in Scotland, Stuart Henry kicked off the tour there, and after a good dinner which followed the first day's show in Dunoon, he forcibly expressed his feelings about the standard of interviewees booked by producer Ben Lyons. You need to know that Ben was a very nice Scottish gentleman, schooled in the best traditions of BBC Scotland, and to make his programmes interesting he would line up the town provost and the local great and the good. Stuart didn't see it this way. As he put it, "Ben, there's too many of your fucking worries today. Tomorrow I do not wish to interview the local schoolmaster or the priest or any other bloody busybody. I want to talk to local bands and to the beauty queen." I don't think anyone had ever spoken to Ben in quite those terms before, but he got the message and we were free of fucking worthies from then on. Sometimes a good dinner does wonders for frank speaking. Paul Burnett too was to suffer in a different way under Ben in a later tour. Paul had taken his wife Nicole and their 2 children with him as a sort of holiday. Their idea of a trip out was to the beach, funfair or amusement arcade, and they had to use all their wiles to avoid Ben's worthy itinerary of the local museums and churches. Poor Ben, he meant well. There was another ongoing problem. If there was no toilet facility nearby, this could be very difficult for the DJ, as he was unable to leave the vehicle during the show. The sight of poor Stuart Henry peeing into an empty milk bottle in the back corridor was not the most attractive one. One day, while Stuart was in full flow, so to speak, his producer walked up the back steps leading to the rear door of the caravan, and he called out, "Oh, Stuart, we'd like you to meet Miss Scotland. She's just coming up the steps." Well, you can imagine the scene as the DJ quickly tried to stop what he was doing, hide the nearly full bottle, and button himself up. It was hilarious. Stuart was less than amused when he discovered it was all a big joke, and Miss Scotland had not yet appeared. This escapade led to the construction of the emergency caravan-type portaloo in a cupboard behind the stage. Inevitably there were arguments about whose responsibility it was to empty it. Smiley Miley, being the driver, took on that role in addition to his many other tasks, but he insisted, only number ones, no big jobs. The sales in the now separate Goodymobile were building nicely, but in Bognor Regis there was trouble. Tony pulled up outside the hotel with the caravan and popped into reception to ask about where to park. While he was in there, the Range Rover was broken into by 4 lads who managed to escape with the previous day's takings. Although they were chased, they managed to get away with the lot. Because Tony Miles was always joking around and smiling in all weathers, he'd been christened Smiley Miley, but that was the one day when he failed to live up to his nickname. The tour continued. Many locals were interviewed, and we tried to reflect interesting events and people in each town, sometimes with quite unexpected outcomes, but that's the fun of genuine live broadcasting. In Scarborough, David Hamilton was surprised when talking to the director of the Flamingo Zoo Park to be paced with a lion cub and a talking orangutan, although when it came to the opportunity it wouldn't say a word. No surprise there then. Other interviewees were more forthcoming. In Blackpool, DLT was interviewing the manager of a local sewage works in Lancashire, and after joking with him about his job, he remarked, "Well, Dave, one man's sewage is another man's bread and butter." I hope not. There was one occasion later in that tour when we did interview the local beauty queen, only to have her denounced loudly by a member of the audience. "Hey, she's married and the mother of 2 children." The summer tour ended in South Shields in appalling weather. We had intended to shoot Smiley as a human cannonball from a circus cannon, but we couldn't do this because the net was out of sight. Not surprisingly, Fog on the Tyne was the most popular record. Yet despite this, several thousand people turned up. Having successfully completed 2 tours, the future of the Roadshow seemed pretty secure. After 2 years of touring, we needed to look at the scheduling of the programme. All through the summer there had been occasional interruptions from noisy, if enthusiastic, supporters in the crowd. They'd been at the local brew since midday, and by evening could be something of a nuisance. Their catcalls and occasional obscenities could be heard via our audience microphones. It was a free show, so we couldn't very well throw them out, though on occasions we had to call in the local police to restore order. If there had been any transport problems the night before, and there were quite a few mechanical breakdowns, then the crew arrived late and had little sleep before starting all over again. To overcome the hecklers and the logistics, it was obvious we needed to change the broadcast time, and this we did the following year. In 1975 it was decided we'd schedule the transmission from 11:30 till 1. In year 3 we made more use of the separate vehicle, the Goodymobile. It was found quite advantageous to park the DJ there after the show to sign autographs, as that gave the crew space to start the business of de-rigging. The weather wasn't all that kind that summer, and in Tywyn in Wales, as the crew arrived to set up on the sea wall, the wind was gale force 8, and the waves were breaking over the caravans. No matter, the show must go on. Producer Dave Price decided to take the stage canopy down in case it blew away. And after the tide dropped, the sun came out, so no wet DJ, but we had another problem, 2 bomb scares. The local police found nothing, and eventually Paul Burnett managed to entertain several hundred fans. Paul was quite a wit, and in the log he wrote his comments in the style of a World War II pilot waiting to go on operations. The ticking of the bedroom clock seems to fill the room. It's always like this the night before a big show. Each man is wrapped in his own thoughts, and it's always worse for the married men. Smiley Miley, a tousle-haired lad from Bristol, is the only exception. He's a veteran of so many ops he seems quite nerveless, and has an attitude that belies his 19 years. Squadron leader Dave Price leaps from his chair, his eyes wild and staring. "My God," he says, "I've just realised it's Swansea's holiday week. It'll be a massacre." He collapses sobbing, and as he is carried away we are all reminded that every man has his breaking point. I myself am confident I can take anything they throw at me. That was Paul Burnett. By the time we arrived in the West Country, we were attracting crowds of over 10,000 people a day. This was fine, but some of the local councils were totally unprepared, and instead of metal crash barriers they had only supplied wooden slats or a string of coloured flags. Not very good for health and safety. We always tried to encourage the audiences to be seated on the grass in front of the stage, as it helped visibility for those further back and avoided people getting crushed at the front. Another problem was that we were starting to attract lobbyists out to exploit the live situation. In Bude we were followed by one group of comically dressed young folk, the CSSM, who were out to spread the word of Jesus by inveigling themselves onto the airwaves under the pretext of asking for a request. If they couldn't do it this way, they would patrol the captive audience and distribute their tracts. In Bognor Regis we were encouraged in our rigging endeavours by some local meth drinkers, one of whom insisted on dancing round on one leg with his trousers rolled up. Was this, we wondered, some quaint old Masonic method of welcoming strangers to Sussex, or some obscure type of Morris dance? One year, to ensure everyone in town knew where we were, I organised a large helium-filled Radio 1 balloon, the idea being that we would fly it high over the top of the site so that it could be seen for miles. Trouble was, I hadn't allowed for the sea breezes, which generally ensured that the thing was flying at an angle of 45 degrees or less. The rubber paint, too, caused a problem, as it was prone to come off on the handler. I was seen one day with bright red and blue hair, much to the amusement of the staff. This one was quietly abandoned after a few weeks until years later, when we had a full-size hot air balloon built by Don Cameron of Bristol. This in the shape of a DJ's head. It was much more successful for promotion and prize flights. I wonder, though, why did it look remarkably like a cross between Gary Davis and Simon Bates? I never found out. Noel Edmonds did his first week on the Roadshow and had some fun at Smiley Miley's expense in Clacton. He started a rumour we were to tow the caravan with donkeys, only to have us inundated with carrots. Such was the affection of the Roadshow fans. Next day Smiley indulged in one of his many practical jokes when he contrived to emerge from the back of the stage behind Noel on a real donkey. Next week David Hamilton was the victim and was equally surprised when Smiley turned up on August Bank Holiday at Cleethorpes on a live camel. This was rapidly becoming the Radio 1 Ark show. The craze for animals grew as the tour progressed. A year later it was elephants, as Jerry Cottle and his circus were performing nearby and were co-opted by Smiley to add to the entertainment. David Hamilton was presented with two newborn pygmy goats, Diddy and David, and later in his week Humphrey, another real camel, turned up. David was brought down to earth in Bidlington when one of the stout Yorkshire folk said to him at the autograph session, David, we were expecting big things of you, having seen you on telly. It's a right shame seeing you brought down to this." The most scary Roadshow moment came on May the 18th, 1975, at Mallory Park Racetrack near Leicester. It was another summer Sunday, and over 40,000 people were packed into the circuit for a Radio 1 Fun Day. The Fun Day, which was my promotional idea for the network, was a natural development of the Radio 1 roadshows. It seemed to me that if we combined the appeal of Radio 1 DJs and personal appearances of pop stars with that of motor racing, we would attract fans of both and be on to a winner in terms of mass appeal, and we'd be promoting the station to a different set of people. A year earlier, in 1974, we had tested the water at Brands Hatch Circuit with the enthusiastic support of the MD, John Webb. He had added additional appeal by setting up a race in identical race cars. These were Ford Escorts driven by the DJs and pop personalities. If John was prepared to risk his cars, our DJs needed no encouragement to drive fast on a track, so we were away. It was a huge success, a full programme of motor racing and lots of popular entertainment, all packed into a single day. There had only been one hiccup, and that involved DJ egos. Tony Blackburn and David Hamilton had each been to see me prior to the event, each one trying to get something over the other in terms of the billing. Who would be in charge if they were each doing a show? I thought I'd resolved it when I suggested they should both fly in together in a special helicopter so that it would look as if they were equally important. When the posters were printed, however, my boss Derek Chinnery created hell with John Webb and insisted that the whole lot were reprinted, with Tony Blackburn being given the top billing. Even after this, Tony was still complaining that his name wasn't printed in large enough type on the poster. On the day we made a couple of very entertaining broadcasts, and profits from the event turned into a large amount of money for the Variety Club of Great Britain's Sunshine Coach Appeal for handicapped youngsters. I had no wish for Radio 1 to be perceived as a metropolitan-based station, and having proved it worked in the South East, I was keen to let other parts of the country see what we could do. So it was that our 1975 spring outing was planned in another of John Webb's circuits, Mallory Park in the Midlands. The geography of Mallory Park is different from Brands Hatch in that the racetrack runs round the outside of a lake which has an island in the middle. The Roadshow was set up on one side of the track behind the race spectators, and the whole thing was planned so that we could mount a live Radio 1 broadcast in the morning before racing proper started, and another one late afternoon between the races. Dave Atke was the senior producer in charge of the roadshows, and David Hamilton the main presenter. We'd sought the cooperation of the record industry and arranged promotional visits by current chart stars. With the huge audiences Radio 1's attracted, there was no shortage of acts queuing to appear. Dave Atke was very good at this type of show, and in our on-air promotion of the day, we announced that most of the Radio 1 DJs would be in attendance, as well as Shawaddy Waddy, Slade with Noddy Holder, the 3 Degrees, and top of the bill the biggest chart toppers since the Beatles, Scotland's Bay City Rollers. These boys were to be flown in during the afternoon in a helicopter piloted by another friend, Mike Barrett. By lunchtime we knew we were in trouble. Although we had planned it with the cooperation of the Leicester Police, they had not realised how big a day it was going to be. Such was the attraction that over 40,000 people turned up. They managed to get into the circuit, but by 11 a.m. another 20,000 were stuck in appalling traffic jams, unable to get anywhere near the action. Among them was my boss, the then controller of Radio 1, Derek Chinnery, who phoned to say that he was abandoning his visit. Just how bad things were was brought home to John Webb and me by the Chief Constable, who summoned us both at mid-morning for a dressing down. He said forcefully, "Well, I don't know what we're going to do. The traffic's at a standstill all over the area. I'm unable to get any more police into the ground to control things, and when the Bay City Rollers arrive there will be a riot, which I will be unable to control. People could be killed, and you two are responsible." "Simple," I said. "I'll call Mike Barrett and tell him not to bring in the rollers by helicopter." "Well, if you do that, it's my view there could be a riot caused by the disappointed fans." We tossed around various ideas and came up with the notion that we would abandon the afternoon roadshow from the stage behind the spectators and move the location of the actual broadcast to the island in the middle of the lake. This is where we had already prepared a hospitality and green room area in a marquee for our guests. This we thought would make the broadcast secure, and at the same time the audience who were watching the racing would be able to see the stars as they arrived. The morning roadshow broadcast went well, and the motor racing programme started while Tony Blackburn and Shawaddy Waddy gave exhibitions of water skiing on the lake. Around mid-afternoon I called up Mike Barrett in the helicopter and explained that I wanted him to land the rollers on the island in the middle of the lake near our hospitality marquee. He brought in the Jet Ranger to land while the race was in progress, thinking the fans would be distracted. We had not allowed for the fanaticism of the teenage Bay City Roller fans, who were light-crazed lemmings. As soon as they caught sight of the helicopter landing, they stormed the track, dodging the racing cars travelling at over 100 miles an hour, and ran straight into the water, trying to get to the island to touch, squeeze, kiss or fondle the objects of their attention. The race organisers immediately stopped the race, so at least no one was killed, but the danger wasn't over. Whether the fans could swim or not appeared irrelevant to those of us on the island. We looked on in amazement as hundreds of young girls dashed into the water towards us. Race marshals, more used to handling car crashes, were obliged to abandon their positions by the track and tried to stop the fans, but to little effect. Noddy Holder stood open-mouthed as hysterical girls crawled up the bank of the island past him, ignoring all the other pop names. My life flashed before me as I visualized my career going down with the drowning girls. And while all this was going on, David Hamilton, like the trooper he is, continued with the live broadcast, and Tony Blackburn blithely carried on water skiing. What a bizarre day. It was one of the worst moments in my whole life as my wife and I, along with other Radio 1 staff, dragged these sobbing, half-drowned young girls out of the water onto the bank. By some amazing stroke of luck, no one was injured, and we managed to struggle through the day. Some fun day. The daily newspapers had a field day at our expense. I managed to keep my job and learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of the fans or what can happen in large crowds. By now, I had persuaded GTO Films, run by Lawrence Myers, to make a cinema film about the Roadshow for distribution as a second feature. I was the executive producer, and Ray Lovejoy, whose claim to earlier fame had been as editor of 2001, was chosen as director. Shooting took place during the summer of 1976. Ray Lovejoy and I had numerous planning meetings to sort out the schedule, and we settled on 3 main locations to shoot: Tenby with Ed Stewart, Whitby with Dave Lee Travis, and Newquay with Noel Edmonds. The opening sequence involved a shot of vehicles driving in convoy up the M1. But to get it right, I spent half a day driving up and down between 2 junctions, doing it over and over again. Eventually, Ray was happy with that road sequence, which he wanted to cut against the Dave Lee Travis and Paul Burnett of Convoy GB. The closing scenes were done in Fang's Disco in Paddington, with Paul Gambaccini and Paul Burnett as star DJs. Being natural show-offs, all the DJs cooperated well, playing up for the camera, and I was pretty happy with the film we shot. Eventually, when it was all in the can, it was not without problems, not mine, but Ray's. As we celebrated Radio 1's 9th birthday on September the 30th, 1976, I heard that Ray had gone over budget and wasn't able to pay the technicians. The ACCT union were blacking the film until the outstanding dues had been paid. There then followed a long wrangle between Ray and Lawrence Myers over who was liable for the shortfall. In the end, the bills were settled and the union lifted its ban. The film, Radio 1 on the Road, was a pretty accurate reflection of the shows and what went on behind the scenes. It went out as a second feature to a major Australian film that year, Picnic at Hanging Rock. Thanks to the creative imagination of the DJs, all kinds of supplementary events started to happen quite spontaneously, sort of roadshow spin-offs. Noel and Smiley came up with the idea in Newquay of a milk float race challenge. A local dairy firm loaned 2 milk floats, and because they had mentioned the challenge on air, a large crowd gathered at the local go-kart site to see it happen. After 2 laps, they changed over from milk floats to go-karts and continued the fun. Dave Lee Travis was keen on Dodgem cars, so he initiated the idea of an ongoing Dodgem Championship. Dave, Noel, Smiley Miley and Ed Stewart all had personal motorhomes which they took with them to live in while on the road. Some of the DJs took their wives and in some cases their children with them, and Dave Lee Travis even brought along his mum and dad for a week. The relatives mucked in too and even helped to sell souvenirs in Smiley's goodie. Smiley proved to be as big a star as the DJs, and he was a splendid organiser. By now he was also employing several more staff to operate the goodie mobile, and sometimes instead of a hotel meal he would organise a barbecue on the beach for his people, and all of the BBC staff too. By now we were being visited by various company pluggers who would bring down current record stars to promote their latest record, so it was a pretty big crowd. There was always someone with a guitar, and after dinner it would turn into a sing-along with silly games. Shades of Cliff Richard and Summer Holiday, but we did it for real. Over the years it became a tradition that we finished the tour at Weston-super-Mare, and as Tony's home was at nearby Flax Bourton, He would always stage the last barbecue of the season at his home, when everyone would be invited for a last great evening out to round off the tour. If we didn't have a barbecue on tour, there would be an evening of fun over a meal in the hotel restaurant, and it was here bunnying came into its own. You might ask, what is bunnying? It's more fun after a few drinks, but basically it's a game of forfeits where each player has to react to a signal from the person appointed as the chief bunny, and on cue he has to raise his bunny ears, or his hands, held up to the side of his or her face. The slowest person to react, or the one who reacts incorrectly, is the victim, and required to do a range of tasks within the dining room. Rearrange the pictures on the wall, stand on the bar and sing God Save the Queen, remove the goldfish from the aquarium, drink a beer through a sock, change clothes with the person sitting on your right, drink a sherry glass of vinegar, clean the men's toilet, and so on. You get the picture. It was all part of the harmless family fun, and frequently the other hotel guests would join in too. All this created a bond between us and the public, which was reflected in the daily broadcasts. This is why we appealed to family audiences who followed the show. No wonder it was so popular with the public. They were only sharing our enjoyment in staging it. We were not without our critics. One day in Weymouth, a policeman turned up on his motorbike to say that an elderly lady living in a cove a couple of miles away was complaining about people playing a very loud transistor radio. Noel quickly turned it to an advantage by leading the audience in simultaneously shouting, "Sorry!" very loudly. Everyone wanted to get involved. In air, the Royal Navy's Rescue Service offered to fly a helicopter over the caravan and drop in Lieutenant Anthony Bull, their observer, for an interview, an offer which was quickly accepted by producer Ben Lyons. Dave Lee Travis was presented with a kipper for his breakfast by Lieutenant Bull, and after he had conducted the interview, back came the helicopter to winch up the observer and take him back to base. Quote from the log of Dave Lee Travis. Throughout the week I had the feeling the team were trying to undermine my activity by constantly throwing kippers at me. 1. During my week, 3 Radio 1 wasps got into my corner at the same time. 2. I only managed to get rid of 2 of them. 3. When the third one was evicted, Tony Miles sold it without my permission. And a quote from Noel Edmonds' log. Now I've received the cheque from the BBC, I can state quite categorically that it was like a holiday. The BBC should take more interest in DJ's welfare and give tuition in hangover cures caused by Harvey Wallbangers. After 4 years there was another dark cloud looming, and that was the state of our little caravan. It had never been built for such a challenging operation, had been round Britain 4 times, and by now was leaking. The lighting and the public address systems weren't powerful enough, the chassis was warped, and it wasn't big enough for the size of the show. The Roadshow was a proven success. It would run for a while, and so I made the case for us to have a purpose-built Roadshow truck. The new Roadshow vehicle was quite a step forward, towed by a brand new BBC white Range Rover with a fold-down stage and a better public address, and lights as well as a purpose-built control room for the engineers. We started to put on an Easter tour in addition to the summer one. It just grew bigger and bigger. The first usage of the new trucks was over Easter 1977, and the show was in Newcastle on April the 4th with Dave Lee Travis. Mind you, we nearly lost the producer before we started. Dave Price was the main man, and I'd gone to see him and to see that all went well with the launch. We stayed at the Holiday Inn, and after a good evening it seemed like a good idea to go for a swim. I didn't realise that Dave couldn't swim, and he, emboldened by the drink no doubt, tried to dive into the deep end. Luckily I was nearby, and after he'd swallowed half the pool I managed to drag him out, as I didn't want to produce the show myself. Ironically, some years later Dave sadly drowned in a canal following a blackout caused by his diabetes, and I still miss him very much. There were a few additional series designed to maximise the use of the vehicle. These were staged on Saturdays, and one such was a programme called The Music Machine, devised by that same Dave Price. This flashy piece of equipment gave the audience a chance to pick the records which would be played via a lottery wheel. We christened it at Longleat on April the 16th, 1977, where, unusually, we were recording, not broadcasting live. The staff there were very friendly and organised a splendid lunch for all of us, including DJ Simon Bates and our star guest, Doctor Who, played by Tom Baker. All this was in support of our colleagues in BBC Enterprises, who were staging a Doctor Who exhibition at Longleat House. It proved to contain the shortest personal appearance ever on Radio 1. I should have foreseen trouble when over lunch the waiter asked Tom if he would like red wine or white wine. Thank you," said Tom. "I'll have both." Theatrical pause. "I'll have both in the same glass." Actors, don't you just love 'em? Anyway, came the time of the recording. Simon Bates did his stuff and introduced the star of our show, Doctor Who himself. Here he is, Tom Baker. Tom shuffled onto the stage in his long coat and scarf, and Simon started to interview him, whereupon Tom dried. Was it too much mixed wine? I'll never know, but Simon was furious. Putting his hand over the microphone, he said through clenched teeth, "Listen, you bummer, don't mess around with me when I'm doing a show as if it were live." Well, the shocked expression on Tom's face had to be seen to be believed, and that was the end of the appearance. "Thank you very much, Tom Baker," said Simon, as the sad doctor made his exit to a desultory round of applause. Thank God for the facility to edit. When the show went out next day, nothing untoward was noticed except that the appearance was very short. You might think I'm only reading about our successes, but I can't claim that the Music Machine roadshows fitted into this category. There was a run of about 14 in all, and the worst one was at Snetterton in Norfolk, where the RAC British Kart Championship was being held. Now, there may have been an affinity between us and motor racing, but when it came to kart fans in the wet, it was awful. The weather was so bad, producer Dave Price took pity on the few people who'd gathered to watch and invited them onto the stage under the shelter of a canopy to watch Simon Bates do his thing. I think it was the only time when the staff outnumbered the audience. As Dave wrote in his log regarding the sales, Smiley did not have a good day, and he was not smiling. It was the sort of occasion when the old DLT line to the audience had effect. Let's all join hands and try and make contact a living. It was more than appropriate on that day. The summer tour was much better. I decided to produce a week for myself to see if I could still do it. Dave Lee Travis and I worked out a routine for the warm-up whereby he explained how sensitive the microphones were, and then he would light up a cigar and blow smoke into one of the mics. Out of sight on another mic, fed to the public address, I would cough my heart out, so it looked to the audience as if it was the microphone that was coughing. Certainly an icebreaker along with all Dave's other routines. Dave, though, could play it rough. On one occasion he was driving in Norfolk, and having been annoyed by a slower driver, he drove past him in a not very clever piece of overtaking. He roared away, only to find Mr. Slowcoach behind him at the next set of traffic lights. Mr. Slowcoach got out, walked carefully up to Dave Carr's and tapped on the window. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Is this your road? Only I wonder if I may share it with you." For once it was DLT's turn to be speechless. Tony Blackburn did a week at the height of the holiday season in Devon and Cornwall. Here's what he wrote in the log. I assume it's tongue-in-cheek. "By Jove, what a wonderful week. The crowds loved me, the producer thought I was wonderful, and I have to agree. I'm going to be a very difficult act to follow. The weather could have been better. Even I couldn't alter that, although I tried several times. Modestly yours, Tony Blackburn." Kid Jensen joined the team, and he too was a big success. By now, such was the popularity of the DJs and the size of the crowds, particularly in the southwest, that we had to seek the help of the police to get people like Noel in and out of the show. The DJs were bigger than rock stars. I was amazed here was such enthusiasm to see what was basically a man playing records in a caravan on the beach. One man was so angry he hadn't managed to get Noel's autograph that he jumped on the bonnet of his car in an attempt to stop him as he drove out. Even if the weather was bad, it made little difference. We required more and more stewards to manage the crowds. There were always lost children to be reunited with their parents, and we needed the St. John ambulance people to deal with fainting girls. The autograph signing, when it was possible, took ages. The police were marvellous, and often would provide 1 or 2 motorcycle outriders to get the DJ and key staff away at the end of the show. What had we started here? It was clear now we needed very careful planning and crowd control in order to avoid people getting hurt. By the end of 1977, we estimated that around 400,000 people had seen one or more shows on the road in that year. On one bank holiday we were at Doddington House, Chipping Sodbury, where the Knights of Arkley put on a splendid jousting display. As a token BBC boss, I was elected for execution. I had to wear a knight's helmet on my skull, while live on air one of the cast members sank an axe into my skull. In reality it was a 3-inch block of balsa wood, but I'm told by those watching it looked pretty spectacular. I'm sure there were a few who wished it had been for real. Peter Powell had joined the team by this time, and he too embraced the spirit of the show during his first week on the road. It didn't take long before he was christened Radio 1's Action Man, on account of his willingness to undertake any daring live stunt. In Tenby he nearly came a cropper, where we had arranged with the army that for the programme opening he would arrive on a stage, sliding down a zip wire rigged from the top of the nearby cliffs. He'd been told that whatever he did he must not swing from side to side while descending. Unfortunately, in the excitement of the live broadcast he forgot the warning, and consequently the speed picked up and the zip ran away with him, and in attempting to slow it down he suffered severe burns and cuts to his wrist. On another occasion, when we were staging a week out in Birmingham, he did a live abseil down the side of the highest building. During another week in Norfolk he jumped out of a plane, commentating as he parachuted down. I remember thinking, if this goes wrong we should be the first network to carry the live broadcast of one of our DJs dying. Luckily he landed safely. We almost had a real tragedy in Bude on August the 24th. It was a very hot day. Paul Burnett was running the show, and 5 minutes before the red light went on he took a swig of coke from a can on the DJ desk, not realising there was a wasp inside, and he swallowed it. He coughed it up, but it stung him deep inside the throat. Brian Patton, the producer, asked the crowd if there was a doctor in the audience. The doctor arrived and said we had about 20 minutes to get Paul treated. What we needed was an antihistamine injection. Smiley jumped into his Range Rover with the doctor, and they drove to the nearest chemist to buy the injection. They rushed back through the crowd where Paul had started the show. The doctor gave him the jab and suggested Paul should eat lots of iced lollies. On air his voice sounded half an octave higher, and it was changing as the swelling infected his throat. He got a tremendous reaction from the audience when he said he would try to complete the show. He did manage it, looking a little pale, and our press officer turned it into a good story which ran in the Express, the Sun and the Mirror. The DJs diced with death again on April the 2nd. As a publicity stunt, while doing another Radio 1 Fun Day at Brands Hatch, we organised Eddie Kidd to jump on his motorbike over most of the Radio 1 DJs laid side by side. We took out insurance for £1 million on them, and they all drew straws for position. Kid Jensen drew the longest and was therefore nearest the ramp, while Tony Blackburn drew the short one and was at the end of the line and looked away at the moment of truth. DLT was somewhere near the middle, with the unenviable task of doing a commentary live into the Roadshow as Eddie jumped. Not the most relaxed moment of his career, nor was it for the others. Noel Edmonds, he shut his eyes, John Peel, Bob Kilby, Simon Bates, Anne Nightingale, Peter Powell and Paul Gambaccini. Eddie was a true showman and built up the tension by doing one false run when he turned away from the ramp at the last minute, then another successful one. I didn't have to look for a replacement team of DJs after all. All too quickly the Roadshow was 10 years old. It was 1982, and this huge show was by now a household institution. In the first 10 years we'd covered 51,000 miles, and goodness knows how many sites. We started to tour in the troubled province of Northern Ireland, where the fans were desperate for light relief from the problems. Jimmy Hawthorne, the controller for Northern Ireland, had convinced me we'll be safe. The only trouble you get will be from fans who don't get their requests played. No change there then. The Northern Ireland Tourist Board were also very supportive, and to allay any fears I produced the first week myself with Kid Jensen as the DJ. Mind you, we nearly didn't get there because there was a Liverpool dockers strike due on the day we were going to sail, but somehow the drivers, Bob Ericsson and John de Grey Birch, along with Smiley's crew, managed to get the vehicles there on time. We decided against starting on Monday, July the 12th, as that was Orange Day, and with all the marches taking place, we thought that might have been a step too far. Not wishing to push our luck, we did our first show in Port Rush on Tuesday, July the 13th. We worked with local BBC man Harry Adair, who had a fund of knowledge about the scene there and what would make good radio. It's true to say we were a little nervous, and over dinner that night at the Northern Counties Hotel, so was a young waitress who served us. She managed to throw a plate of chicken over one of Smiley's assistants and drop some snails down the back of our production secretary, Eileen Fitch's, dress. After dinner we toddled off to our beds, but at 2 a.m. we were woken by the sound of loud explosions. "Oh my God, are we under attack? Is the IRA after the contents of Smiley's goodie?" But no, it was a local lifeboat maroon that summoned the crew to the aid of a fisherman in distress. Everyone back to sleep. Next day we woke up to pouring rain, but it eased. Over 3,000 locals turned up, and Kid Jensen did a fine show, including a competition to find Captain Sensible lookalikes, Smiley having supplied berets and oversized sunglasses. In his words, "Now we're having a good time." Back on the mainland, the next week was the 10th anniversary of the Roadshow, and big things were planned in Newquay, where we had started. On Sunday afternoon I drove down to Cornwall with Jeanette, my secretary, who'd picked me up from the airport on my return from Northern Ireland. On the way down the M4 my concentration must have lapsed a little, because the Thames Valley Police, in a plain car, booked me for speeding. That took the edge off my celebratory mood. Jeanette drove the rest of the way as I sat in the back in a grump doing my expenses. Good humour was restored on arrival at the Atlantic Hotel, where we were reunited with Alan Freeman, Mike Reid, the boss Derek Chinnery, and producers Stuart Grundy, who'd been in on the conception of the Roadshow, Tim Blackmore, and of course General Brian Patton and his secretary Margaret Bradley. Monday, July the 19th, was as close as we could get to the anniversary. The mayor of the town organised a parade of vintage cars with ladies in Edwardian costumes. They were passengers, along with Miss Newquay, the town crier, and of course the two DJ stars, Alan Fluff Freeman and Mike Reid, looking splendid in blazers and straw boaters. The route took us through the town to the North Fistral Beach. Alan appeared by permission of Capital Radio, to which he had returned earlier in the year, and after the broadcast there was a civic reception, lots of champagne, and a special cake in the shape of a figure 1 for me to cut. Mike Reid was also in a very celebratory mood, as he had just been chosen to present the Saturday morning television show for BBC One. Mike Reid was as big a practical joker as Smiley. One time he brought joke sugar lumps and put them on the breakfast table for the crew. When added to the tea, they turned it into a foaming mass of froth. But it was on this tour that the practical jokes between Mike and Smiley really moved up a gear. It all started in Barnstable, when Mike got up from bed one morning, and when he went down to his Mercedes sports car after his breakfast, he found it was on blocks, with no wheels. War was about to break out. A couple of days later, while we were having dinner, 2 CID plainclothesmen, built like brick outhouses, according to Simon Bates, turned up and arrested Smiley on the excuse that there was an irregularity in his number plates. He was white and trembling as he told his wife that he had to go with them. He was handcuffed, put in the back of the police car and taken away. The police told him he was going to Cardiff. He was not amused at being set free a few miles down the road, dressed only in his underpants, to be told it was all the work of Mike Reid. Revenge required a lot of elaborate planning. Smiley knew that at the slightest opportunity Mike would start to play his guitar, and this he did regularly as part of the live show or as part of the evening fun and games. To facilitate his plan, Smiley bought an identical model of guitar and he rigged this with an electronically triggered explosive charge and a red smoke dye. All was now ready. The staff, of course, had to be in on it. Producer Mike Williams and Secretary Eileen Fitches, as well as the local police. The latter agreed to participate, as long as there were no unusual deaths or murders overnight, sir. The first thing which Smiley needed was to get Mike Reed out of his bedroom so that he could steal his precious guitar. In order to do this, he asked the hotel to cut off all the bedroom phones. He knew that Mike had to make a promotional phone call to the breakfast show, and with the bedroom phones out of order, Mike would have to go down to reception to make the call. While all this was going on, Smiley nipped in, stole the guitar, and left the bedroom window open with a muddy footprint on the ledge, so that it looked like a burglary. Producer Williams and Secretary Eileen Fitches also reported items missing from their rooms, so it looked like a genuine robbery. The police were called and took statements from those concerned, and although he was suspicious, Mike had to accept it as a genuine robbery. Just before transmission, the police turned up to confirm they had found a car with the guitar and several other missing items in the boot, but they were sorry they would be unable to return the items until some time after the show. They were needed as evidence. On the Roadshow that day, the star guests who were to play live were Kid Creole and the Coconuts. During the audience warm-up, Mike explained to the crowd that he would be unable to play to entertain them as his guitar had been stolen that morning. Kid Creole offered Mike his own, the doctored guitar. The show started, and at 11:15 it was time for Mike's regular little guitar entertainment. He started to play, and on cue from Smiley, the electronic charge was set off, covering Mike with a bang, smoke and red dye. All this live on the air. For once, Mike was speechless. Luckily, we always had standby cover in London, and Mike Smith quickly stepped in to cover the resulting confusion until Smiley was able to explain to the listeners what had happened. It was probably the ultimate practical joke, and to my knowledge has never been topped. Simon Bates was the victim of another practical joke which sort of misfired a few days later. The Roadshow was in Barmouth, when Smiley and Mike Reed had persuaded a member of the hotel staff to become a topless breakfast waitress. Her job was to wait until Simon was in the middle of his morning live promotional phone call to Mike Reed's breakfast show in London, when she would burst in and cover him with embarrassment. What Smiley and Mike didn't know was that Simon slept in the buff, and when the girl walked in she saw more than she had bargained for. Simon, to cover his confusion, leapt into the wardrobe while clutching the phone, still trying to continue the conversation with Mike Reed. "Mike, please ask her to leave, I'm starkers," was all Simon could gasp. Mike, of course, knew what was going on and played it up for all it was worth. Big laughs all round, and another story for the national press. In Brighton, Peter Powell was presenting and Dave Atke producing when Smiley announced that he had a special 10th anniversary cake for Peter to cut during the show. Some of the candles had blown out, so Smiley gave Peter a lighter to reignite them, but as Peter flicked it out came a mass of foam all over the beautiful cake. Peter was horrified, but tried to carry on like a pro and set about cutting the cake. As it was made of concrete, the knife didn't make much of an impression, so Smiley, with an evil smile, handed him an electric drill. Another one up to Tony Miles. We were making more demands on the engineers and drivers because it was now clear that we could make a better entertainment by having musicians playing live music on stage, as well as having pop people along for a chat, and maybe they would mime to their single. When we had Chaz and Dave play in Margate, because the stage air was limited, we could only place the drum kit on the stage, while the piano had to be on the sounds. We needed a bigger stage and more microphones. The 10th tour ended where it began, back in the West Country, with the original producer Brian Patton, who, with Margaret, his long-serving secretary, they'd done a wonderful job. But Brian was due for retirement, and this was to be the end of their time on the Roadshow. During Brian's career at the BBC in Bristol, he had produced a wide range of programmes for all networks, and I suppose that he will be best remembered always for the Johnny Morris programmes. Always cheerful and willing to try anything, he was one of the kindest and most hard-working people I had ever met. We were so sorry to say goodbye, and he wrote in the log for the last time. I have always felt privileged to produce the road shows. They have the spirit of the circus. Moving on every day is a great stimulus. I think the shows have produced something very precious, a spirit that is almost like a sports team. It is certainly an operation unique in the BBC, and I feel proud to be part of it. We said our goodbyes with a sad heart, and I was especially sorry to see Brian go. Within a year he was dead. Farewell, old friend, we salute you, and we miss you still. So, that was almost that. By the end of 1982, vehicle number 2 was worn out. It was too small, and as I just explained, we were expanded and needed small bands to play live on stage. A scheme was proposed for the Mark III version, this one to be an articulated truck much bigger than the current one. Work was underway, and the Mark II show made its last appearance in Covent Garden on September the 10th. Dave Lee Travis was the DJ, and some of the show was simulcast on the BBC World Service for the very first time. To send it off, Kate Bush, Adam Ant and David Essex all turned up, and Arabesque, a group of street buskers, played live on stage. There's not a lot more to tell. We took delivery of the new Mark III vehicle and again went off to Northern Ireland. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we took it to Berlin and broadcast from the Brandenburg Gate. That was a show which nearly didn't happen. Richard Greaves, our driver, had driven up through Europe and followed a map which showed the broadcasting site to be on the eastern side of the gate. He set it up, went off to his hotel for a well-earned rest. Next morning, as Simon Bates was about to start a Germanic warm-up, along came a job's worth from a different set of guards, who said, "Well, you're parked on the wrong side of the gate." "Even as the wall has come down, you will not do that sort of thing here. Move it, or you will all be shot." To make matters worse, Richard was told he couldn't drive the vehicle through the Brandenburg Gate itself. He would have to go on a long diversion to reposition it. Richard pleaded their case, and one very helpful guard offered to look the other way while they drove through the gate. They made it in time. But there was another odd occurrence when one English chap from the crowd asked Richard if he could get Simon Bates' autograph. Richard explained that we did autographs after the show had finished and told the chap to come back then. However, he was very persistent and came back 10 minutes later with his passport, again requesting that Simon sign it there and then. Richard takes up the story, he said. The broadcast was underway, and I was standing behind the vehicle when suddenly engineers, producer and secretary came rushing out of the back door. I didn't know what was going on, and I ran in to see Simon crouched down behind the DJ desk. "What's the matter?" I asked. Simon said, "Well, I don't want to worry you, love, but I've just been shot at." I stood there looking around while the record went on playing, and I saw some airgun pellets on the floor, where they bounced off the rear wall. I looked into the crowd and saw the police had seized the autograph-hunting man and his air rifle. We decided not to press charges, and that was the last I heard of it, except for a phone call to my mobile that night. "Richard, Steve Wright here. I understand Bates was shot at today. I don't want to speak to him, but to the man what done it, and complain bitterly because he missed." The practical jokes continued, of course, and the shows just got bigger and bigger. DJs came and went, and so did producers. In the end, the audiences grew so large that we had to start supporting the show with a giant outdoor video screen, so that the people at the back could see everything. We needed more powerful speakers, and as we moved Radio 1 into FM stereo, we needed better quality circuits, so that we had to have a satellite uplink van to send the signal back. Because we started to broadcast more live bands, we needed a bigger sound mixing truck, and so it grew. It was like the circus, more and more people, more and more vans. Certainly the intimacy of the earlier shows was lost, but we were victims of our own success. In time, even the Mark III vehicle was outgrown, and in 1991, at the Gateshead Garden Festival, Her Royal Highness Princess Anne launched the monster set of vehicles that made up the Mark IV Roadshow. This one lasted until the year 2000, when the present management abandoned the Roadshow in favour of different forms of promotion. By then, Richard Greaves was the Radio 1 ringmaster, and he stayed with it to the end. He says that what finished it was the Radio 1 commitment to broadcasting more and more bands live from the stage. As the groups got bigger, he found it increasingly difficult to provide enough staging, public address and equipment to do this properly, so it became an impractical operation. The last person to use it was Chris Moyles in his show One Big Belly in 2000, and after that the mobile vehicle was dropped. As Richard said, "It left a gap, and to this day I still receive inquiries from town entertainment officers asking if there's any chance of it coming back." It was without doubt the biggest daily audience show the BBC ever initiated, and that's a gap that's left that has never been filled. In 1985 I was promoted to controller, and inevitably the Roadshow played a smaller part in my life until I left in 1993. But I'm proud to have started something that lasted for 27 years and which gave so much enjoyment and fun to the Radio 1 audience. Chapter 11. The Chicken's in Danger. After 4 years on the air, by 1972 the station had more or less settled down under controller Douglas Muggeridge. However, we were a long way from providing an all-day music service. Commercially funded opposition was about to be launched, and looming BBC financial problems threatened us all. I wondered about the long-term future for Radio 1. The management under Douglas was now headed by Derek Chinnery, who had replaced Mark White as head of the department. Teddy Warwick was Derek's chief assistant, and as such the more senior of the executives. Doreen Davis was another of the executive producers. It was her role to oversee the daytime strip shows and the production of those music programmes made by our department for the BBC World Service. That left me as the newest executive. I had Noel Edmonds' Sunday show, Radio 1 Club in the evenings, Roscoe's show, Solid Gold 60 with Tom Brown, the network promotion and competitions, and all the technical liaison. Under this management was a team of producers, each responsible for one or more programmes every week. We had an overall plan and philosophy which we tried to implement within the limitations of our broadcasting hours, needle time and budget. It was popular entertainment during the day, presented by the best team of DJs we could find, and coverage of a range of different types of music in the evenings, presented by DJs who had an enthusiasm and an expert knowledge of their subject. All this, coupled with a range of live concert performances and music-based documentaries, made us unique. We knew commercial radio was coming and wanted to consolidate and put ourselves into the strongest possible position. Derek would hold a monthly departmental meeting rather in the style of the headmaster when he gave out the school announcements. During one of these meetings, soon after he'd taken over as head, he came in for a rough ride when he spoke about editorial matters. On the previous evening, John Peel had been heard discussing on air a problem with one of his listeners who'd had VD. John, who was quite unself-conscious about these things, commented in his sympathetic way, "Well, I shouldn't worry too much about it. I had a case of the clap myself, and I got over it." Derek, who was the most honest and straight man I ever met, felt there was no place for this sort of talk on his nice music network and said so. "I don't want to hear this type of comment. If we go off in this direction, we'll be discussing homosexuality on air next." We were a few years away from our no-holds-barred talk shows, yet even with our fairly innocuous presentation, we had more critics. Ludovic Kennedy made a speech in May 73 saying that all our DJs and their audiences were moronic and that the presenters themselves had no respect for the English language. This especially infuriated John Peel, who'd been educated at Shrewsbury, where he demonstrated some considerable talent for English. Rodney Collins, our press officer, had a field day trying to turn that one round as the popular press jumped on the story in a big way. The Sun gave it a big spread, but on the principle that you only have to worry when they stop writing about you, we weren't unhappy. The Daily Mirror ran a poll to find out the most moronic DJ. No, I'm sorry, I can't remember who won. We followed my Beatles story with that of the Rolling Stones, and then in 1973 launched a very ambitious project which was scheduled to last 26 weeks. Tracing the development of popular music, the story of pop was produced by my old friend Tim Blackmore. Over 300 people were interviewed for it, and about halfway through the series, Tim realised he was seriously short of material to complete the series. He was fully occupied writing and producing the series, so it fell to me as executive producer to go back to America with pop pundit Charlie Gillett to try to fill in the gaps. Charlie and I started our research in Los Angeles. This is where we had arranged the key interview, John Lennon. John was at that time living in Bel Air with May Pang. Our friend Tony King, who worked for John, set up the interview. On November the 14th, 1973, we arrived at Lou Adler's house where they were in residence. It was a typical Los Angeles sunny day, and John made us very welcome, offered a drink, and we sat around in the lounge talking of news from Britain. The interview only stopped once when John insisted we break off to watch a TV commercial for John's latest album, Mind Games. For that, Tony King had, without much persuasion, dressed up in drag as Her Majesty the Queen. John was on very good form, and we spent a very relaxed and happy afternoon, talking about the developments in music and recording techniques during his career. We talked about the recent deportation order served on him by the American government, and this next comment demonstrated all too well his priorities. "No way," he said, "am I going to allow them to take me away from all this great music." After that, Charlie and I split up in search of more great music makers. I went to Las Vegas to find Glenn Campbell, and then on to Nashville, while Charlie went to Memphis. Then we met up again in New York before coming home. The list of people we interviewed on that short trip reads like a pop who's who. Herb Alpert and Burt Bacharach at the old Charlie Chaplin film lot, which was now the site of A&M Studios. Roger McGuinn of the Byrds out at Malibu, that was down the Pacific Coast Highway. Martha Reeves of Martha and the Vandellas. Ray Stevens, Don Williams, and Duke Fakir of the Four Tops. I felt particularly stupid as I got to Duke's house because I pulled up fresh from Los Angeles airport, and for the life of me I couldn't extract the key from the hire car ignition. What should I do? It was a quiet neighbourhood, but I couldn't risk leaving it on the street. Only one thing to do, go in and introduce myself to Duke and hope he could help. He soon showed me a hidden release button to free up the key. That broke the ice, and soon we were chatting away like old friends. I made my first visit to Las Vegas. Everything was bigger there. I asked at the airport for a map. "Hell, you don't need no map, sir. There's only one street, the Strip, and that's that." So I made my way down the street to the Hilton, where I was scheduled to interview Glenn Campbell. He made me feel at home in his dressing room, and after we'd finished our interview, he asked me if I'd like to see his show. Naturally, I accepted, and with some other guests was shown to Glenn's personal table at the front of the stage. A waiter came over and growled, "You want a drink?" "Oh, yes, please. I'll have a Jack Daniels and Coke." "Well, how many of those do you need? 'Cause I don't aim to keep coming over to serve you folks all night." "Well, how long is the show?" "About 2 hours. "Okay, I'll have 3 then." He returned and slammed the drinks down on the table. I assume his attitude came from the fact that the drinks were complimentary, so there was no question of his getting any tips. In Nashville, even more bizarre happenings. I had already interviewed the legendary producer Billy Sherrill, but also needed Bob Johnson. Bob's claim to fame was that in 1969 he had recorded an amazing album with Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash, Nashville Skyline. It was the only time the two stars worked together. Bob was a good old boy from Nashville, and he agreed to meet me in his studio where he was mixing an album by Paul Hampton. Paul was an actor turned singer who had appeared in the Diana Ross film Lady Sings the Blues. In the event, Bob was delayed, so he called me up at the studio. "Hey, Johnny, you're some kind of BBC producer, so why don't you go right ahead and make a start on mixing the next track, and I'll join you as soon as I can. When I finish that, we can record our interview." Sounded simple enough, so the engineer and I started work. Bob eventually arrived after a couple of hours. "Okay, man, let's hear what you two have got there." We played back our efforts, and Bob broke into a huge grin and exclaimed, "Man, that sucks. What we need is some aids to better mixing." And he produced a 1-litre bottle of Remy Martin brandy and a huge bag of grass, together with a native Indian peace pipe. He proceeded to pour us each a large glass of brandy, stuffed the pipe with weed, and passed the pipe of peace around to all. Well, when at home, what else could I do? The evening wore on in a happy haze, and good old Bob got happier and happier with the mix, and I kept nagging away about the interview. By 1 a.m. Bob was just about satisfied with his results, and he and I sat down for a serious chat. You can imagine what it sounded like, many giggles with very slurred questions and answers. Next morning I set up the recording machine to play back my interview. It was completely unusable. It never saw the light of day until many years later, when Paul Gambaccini was putting together a 25th anniversary documentary with producer Kevin Howlett, and they dug it out of the archives and had a laugh at the controller's expense. Of course I had to call Bob and rearrange the interview, which we did all over again straight. Let that be a lesson to all of you would-be radio interviewers. Drink and drugs don't mix, certainly not in Nashville. From Nashville it was back to New York to be reunited with the late Charlie Gillett, where we spent another afternoon recording one of Atlantic Records' founding fathers, Aretha Franklin's producer, Jerry Wexler. Jerry invited us to his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park for lunch. I'd met him a few years earlier during a visit to the UK, and he was a fan of Charlie Gillett's book, The Sound of the City, so he was very happy to cooperate. After Jerry, I recorded Richard Perry, another great record producer. Then it was time for home. The Story of Pop was a great success, and through the BBC transcription service, like the Beatles story, it was sold to radio stations all over the world. It was accompanied by our first venture into co-publishing, a written part work by Jeremy Pascal. This got us into trouble with MP Gerald Kaufman, who complained that we were breaking the BBC's charter by being too commercial. The radio series was introduced by Alan Freeman, and from that time Tim and Fluff developed a friendship which lasted for years. Fluff followed Tim to Capitol in later years and subsequently asked Tim to manage him, which he did until Fluff's death in 2006. It was in 1973 that we introduced another important feature, Newsbeat. Until that time, news had been confined to 1-minute bulletins on the half hour, and the idea of 2 15-minute magazine programmes dedicated only to news, sport and entertainment was as welcome to the music producers as a pork chop in a synagogue. However, the time was right for a BBC station like Radio 1 to inform its young audience more fully about what was going on in the world. To make it more palatable, we started with a joint presentation by DJ Ed Stewart and newsman Laurie Mayer. The production team included sport and pop news stories as well as hard news. To deliver news in a way which was acceptable to our audience was a hard brief for the team, and they rose to the challenge very well. If you think about it, what we started then was the format now used by Sky News, but I doubt Mr. Murdoch will give us much credit. We managed to gain a few hours more needle time. Technologically we advanced as we started to record our studio sessions in multi-track, 8 tracks in all, which enabled us to achieve standards nearer those of professional studios. In our music recordings there was a taste of things to come, because Radio 1 was, by then, spotting, recording and nurturing music talent in its own studios, often before recording contracts from record companies had been issued. King Crimson, Osibisa, Medicine Head and Curved Air were all in our Maida Vale studios in the early 70s, recording sessions for broadcast in our late-night shows. I don't want to give you the impression that internally at Radio 1 it was all smooth sailing. Since the merger between popular music and gramophone departments, there had always been considerable differences in producers' attitudes. The split was between those producers, mainly from popular music, who felt that the station should be about a consistent type of music all day, and those mainly ex-gramophone department producers who felt that we should go all out for listening figures and huge audiences. This later proposition disregarded the fact that with some records we would overlap with Radio 2. The split was reinforced by the geography of Egton House, where we all worked. The populists were all on the 4th floor and the cred guys on the 3rd floor. Music credibility versus music popularity. It was a debate that went on continually, and it had not really been resolved 20 years later when I left. When people wonder about management's lack of knowledge regarding Jimmy Savile's activities, it was probably due to the fact that the management offices were apart from the 3rd floor, where Jimmy worked when he came in. I wrote a paper for Derek Chinnery in 1973 where I tried to pull together what I saw as the issues. This is what it said. By aiming at the lowest common denominator in an effort to capture the biggest audience, we will ultimately bring about our downfall. If commercial radio is seen to be doing an excellent job at keeping the masses happy with audible wallpaper, then there will be arguments to say there is no need for the BBC to provide this as well. How much stronger a case we will have for our continued existence if we can be shown to be providing an unparalleled service of popular music, supporting and developing new talent, and doing things which commercial radio is incapable of doing. My goodness, shades of John Burke coming out in me even then. Distinctiveness and difference, years before John's arrival. It wasn't just the executives and producers who thought deeply about this. The more intelligent DJs too had their opinions, though knowing on which side their bread was buttered, most of them kept them to themselves. I had a long chat with Noel Edmonds during a train trip to Manchester. My diary for November the 21st, 1972 read, Noel strikes me as one of the most intelligent and creative DJs we have. He talked about an idea for a show with phone calls from the public to their pop idols, a sort of Radio 1 version of Radio 4's It's Your Line. He is also very aware of the musical interests of the better educated young listener and thinks we ignore them, which makes Radio 1 very unexciting. Why, he asked me, do we continue to use old hands like Jimmy Young, who would be better suited to Radio 2? Well, by coincidence, Noel took over the Radio 1 breakfast show from Tony Blackburn a few months later and lived up to his word of making it really fresh and exciting. It proved to be the best breakfast show we ever had. Features like Kick Out the Jams, The Welly Stickers, School Call, Radio 1's Garden Gnomes, Desmond Ducks, Fiona Fairies for the Christmas Tree, some funny phone calls from Flynn the Milkman and so on. All these things are still remembered today. I remember one of the best stunts Noel ever pulled was on April the 1st, 1974, when he said he was broadcasting from the Kellogg's cornflakes factory and that all the flakes were cut in 144 pieces from sheets of corn dough. He alleged that if you looked carefully you could find the ones that fitted together and invited listeners to empty their packets out onto the breakfast table to see if they could find the pieces that fitted. By now we were starting to demonstrate clearer differences between Radio 1 and 2 by the on-air personalities we employed. Perhaps someone had been listening to Noel's comments because in 1973 Jimmy Young went to Radio 2. Before that, Terry Wogan too had been moved over to be replaced by Alan Freeman. Because Fluff was already working 5 days a week, we decided it was time for a different presenter on the chart show. I decided on a totally different approach based on the American chart shows presented by Casey Kasem in the States. Solid Gold 60 was the title, and we moved away from personality presentation to the facts about the hits given by an unknown with an excellent voice. He was Tom Brown. In September 1972 we were 5 years old. To celebrate our birthday we asked listeners to write a parody of the Ray Stevens hit Turn Your Radio On. This version was called Tune to Radio 1, and it was recorded by a bunch of DJs led by Jimmy Young, Tony Blackburn and Alan Freeman. 1,000 copies were pressed on flexi discs, and these were to be prizes in a Radio 1 balloon race. The night before their release, a gang of secretaries and producers assembled in Broadcasting House to inflate these balloons with helium. The idea being that next morning we would take them up onto the roof and do a special press picture of our DJ team launching them live on The Breakfast Show. No one had told us that rubber was pervious to helium, so I went in early next morning to collect the balloons, and when I went in, instead of finding them floating against the ceiling, they were simply lying limp like used condoms on the floor. What a panic! We were due on the air in an hour, and the press photographers were already having coffee while they waited to snap the scene. I rounded up as many helpers as I could, and we hastily gassed up a few dozen fresh balloons and tied them in with the floppy ones to be carted upstairs. Of course, it was sod's law that morning it was still and calm. Even though we were 8 floors up, there was no hint of a breeze to help us. So I'm afraid that quite a large proportion of those released finished up in Regent Street within a few hundred yards of the BBC. Others were more successful, though, and made it as far away as Manchester. Inevitably, we lost some staff as the new commercial station started to recruit people, and in the early 70s, I too had been approached by George Martin to join Capital Radio. But that came to nothing, although there had been a flurry of interest in some of the national newspapers. They'd got hold of the story. How does that happen? I hadn't said a word. In 1977 I was approached again to join Capital Radio as programme director. John Whitney, their chairman, had made discreet approaches, and we spent a couple of port-lubricated evenings chatting in the Garrick Club. I probably overindulged in the vintage port because I fell asleep in the train going home to Paddock Wood and only awoke as the train was pulling out of the station. I leapt to my feet in a panic and jumped out, clutching my briefcase as the train sped away from the platform. I fell rather awkwardly and grazed myself, but due to the effects of the alcohol, I felt no great pain until the next day, when I discovered that my arm was broken. Some night out that was, and difficult questions next morning from Derek Chinnery as to what had happened. Eventually John Whitney asked me to go for an interview at Capital Chairman Dickie Attenborough's house in Richmond. Dickie was there with Vice Chairman Graham Binns. We went for a Chinese meal. I wondered, were they checking me out whether I knew how to use chopsticks? Things went quite well until John asked me what I saw as the role of education in Capital's programming. I replied that I thought it had little place, as the main obligation of the programme director was to maximise the audience, to enable the sales team to generate revenue, and education wouldn't help much in the achievement of this objective. Wrong answer for John, who still believed that commercial radio should have the same high ideals as the public service stations. I stayed at the BBC. I started to work with Roscoe, writing Emperor Roscoe's DJ Handbook. Mike Pasternak, that's his real name, would ramble into a tape machine with all his thoughts and ideas. My wife Carol would transcribe his ramblings, and I would turn it all into English. This was to be published by Everest Books, and the editor they allocated to it was a chap called Ken Follett. Ken told us that he had had enough of book editing, and when he had finished our book he was thinking of setting up on his own as a writer. Not many years after that he wrote Through the Eye of the Needle, which not only went on to become a bestseller, but was also made into a very successful film. His career as a writer since then has been spectacular. If only our book had enjoyed the same success, though an updated version will be out shortly as an e-book. Back in the wonderful world of Radio 1, spurred on by Noel Edmonds' enthusiasm, we were really getting involved with motorsport. He had the bug and was an enthusiastic race driver, and apart from our involvement with the fun days and celebrity racing, he had found a sponsor for a race car of his own. In April 1974 I took my son David up to Silverstone to see Noel test driving his new Ford Cortina, prepared by Ford's Motorcraft and Wilmot's garage. The pits were freezing cold as we stood around in the bitter northeasterly wind, waiting for some action. I think we wondered why we'd all bothered. We were soon cheered up because apart from Noel on the circuit there were several other racing celebrities. Ronnie Peterson, the F1 driver, was testing his John Player Special, and so was Graham Hill with his Embassy F1 car. Being in the pits we had a real close-up of all the action. David was in his element, especially as we all went to a nearby pub for lunch. One of the other people to turn up that day was a friend of Noel's, Mike Smith. He was equally enthusiastic about motor racing and broadcasting, and the development of his radio career dates back to that chance meeting. Later in the year I was able to announce a further racing tie-up with John Webb at Brands Hatch. Our first fun day there had attracted over 20,000 people and made over £7,000 for charity, so John was keen to continue the cooperation, which seemed to benefit both organisations. Our idea was to lend Radio 1's name as the sponsor of a production saloon car championship. There were to be 20 races at circuits all over the UK, and we chose production saloon cars because Derek Chinnery and I felt our audience would identify with them as they looked as near to normal road cars as possible. Radio 1 DJs would attend each race to make a personal appearance and present the winner's trophy. As we didn't put in any money, merely endorsed it with our name, I saw it as another way to increase the promotion of Radio 1 to the motor racing fans. Labour won the 1974 general election, and for the first time Radio 1 listeners were offered comprehensive coverage through the Newsbeat operation. Richard Skinner had now replaced Ed Stewart as the co-presenter with Laurie Mayer. Staff morale was not helped at this time when we saw the expanding number of new commercial radio stations in Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow and Swansea. All of these were winning more and more press coverage. They could afford professional PR and were coming up with fresh promotional ideas and gaining audience. To try to counter the doom and gloom that was going around, I suggested that the least we could do was to make the working conditions for our DJs and staff more pleasant. In a note to Derek Chinnery I wrote, "The atmosphere in our studios could be so much better if we had them decorated in a sympathetic colour scheme with softer lighting and a restroom in which to relax with telephone, music papers and a record player. The DJs are our stars and we ought to treat them as such and try to build their egos. They need it at the moment." But there wasn't enough money even for a modest scheme like this. We had to wait until 1985 before it happened. I was sent away from the coalface in October for a 2-week senior management course at a large residential country house in Buckinghamshire. There we were addressed by a wide variety of captains of British industry and very senior BBC people. The BBC chairman, Sir Michael Swan, was one of the speakers. At least he had heard of Radio 1 and he asked me a few questions about our news service, Newsbeat, but he had no comment to make about the bulk of our output, music. The Director of Finance, Paul Hughes, gave a depressing overview of the BBC finances, saying that if we didn't receive an increase in the licence fee, we'd be overdrawn on our borrowing limit by £10 million. Maurice Tinniswood, the Director of Personnel, talked about the BBC relations with the unions and confirmed that there was a plan to move many departments out of the West End of London to less well-populated parts of the country. I've always noticed that all BBC decisions are circular. This was back in 1974. Now they've moved a large part of the output to Salford. I was even less encouraged when the Managing Director of Radio, Ian Trethowan, came to address us. He talked of his exciting plans to open another 2 BBC local radio stations. When I told him there was more evidence people would actually like to hear an improved Radio 1 service in the evenings, I was slapped down. "There's little point in doing this. Reception isn't good enough in any case. Radio 1 isn't exciting. BBC local radio is." So there. The Director-General, Alistair Milne, came too. He was in a very aggressive frame of mind, clearly ready to have a go at anyone who challenged him. I got a verbal beating up when I asked about a possible expansion of Radio 1's services. I did, however, come away with the view that he would fight very hard from the corporation's corner when it came to negotiations with the new Labour government. All in all, after 2 weeks at the conference, I came away pretty depressed about my future within the BBC, and I noted in my diary, "Now I'm fully in the picture regarding the overall BBC situation, it puts the role of Radio 1 in perspective. We'll be lucky if we survive, and I can't really see a future for myself here." In November 1974, the Wilson government made it clear that the BBC was unlikely to receive the increase in the licence fee it was looking for, and as it was already £10 million in the red, the BBC found itself in severe financial difficulties. It announced that in order to make ends meet, there would have to be painful cuts in BBC television and radio services. The total money saved by hacking at Radio 1 and 2 was only around £100,000, peanuts in terms of the BBC's £150 million budget, but we had to be seen to make our contribution. The Managing Director of Radio decided that BBC local radio would be exempt, and so would Radio 3. No surprises there, then. A cynical listener might say this demonstrated how little value the top bosses actually placed on Radio 1 and 2, but again I couldn't possibly comment. For the money spent, we were the most effective network in the size of audience, but nevertheless it was decided that Radio 1 should share the pain. For us, the outlook was poor. We went back years. There was more simulcasting with Radio 2. The Easter Roadshow series was cancelled, and we lost nearly all our hard-won stereo output. To make matters worse, we would only be on the air during daytimes. What a cock-up. I believe that some of these cuts were made for cosmetic reasons because they would make headlines and strengthen the BBC's case for an increase in the licence fee. There was a whiff of blackmail in the air too when Controller Douglas Muggeridge suggested that if we really wanted to be on the air in the evenings, we could do so if we agreed to broadcast a couple of hours of further education programmes for young people. I didn't think this would do anything for our credibility, and once it was there, we'd never get rid of it. If that wasn't enough to cause severe depression amongst us all, there was an added smack in the face when Managing Director of Radio, Ian Trethowan, sent for Douglas Muggeridge and told him Radio 1 must cancel the personal appearance of Gary Glitter on the Tony Blackburn show. He wasn't prepared to put up with the noisy disruption and screams caused by enthusiastic fans turning up outside Broadcasting House. There had been a similar occurrence the week before when David Essex had visited our station, and one fan had been injured, so we were the naughty boys and told not to do it again. Were we part of the popular entertainment industry, or what? Certainly not, according to BBC establishment. Same thing happened again a few months later when we had David Cassidy in, and poor Derek had a bollocking from Ian Trethowan, who threatened he would stop all visits by popular artists to Radio 1. The self-flagellation continued. More whips and horsehair shirts. It was tough near the top. As we approached Christmas, things didn't look good, and perhaps the situation got to my boss, Derek Chinnery. Our last day at work was Christmas Eve, but he insisted on having his regular management meeting where he attacked my production of a Radio 1 pantomime and insisted I made cuts on it, with which I disagreed. To make matters worse, when I came back from lunch he'd gone home for Christmas without even wishing any of us a happy Christmas. Merry Christmas, Mr. Scrooge. Surprisingly, in January 1975 it was announced that we would get some sort of licence fee increase, which would add another £50 million to the BBC funds. Even with this, it wasn't possible for BBC management to find the £100,000 needed to restore the cuts on Radio 1 and 2. Despite all this depression and internal aggravation, we retained a large audience share and still had 10.6 million listeners every day. Our involvement with motor racing provided a little light relief from the prevailing gloom when motor racing drivers from all over the country were invited to the Langham Gallery to meet the DJs at a Radio 1 reception. This party was held for the purpose of presenting cheques and trophies won during our production saloon car championship. Next morning, outside Broadcasting House, Noel Edmonds, who'd been a competitor, handed over the keys to another Variety Club Sunshine coach for handicapped children to actor Ron Moody. This had been purchased entirely through funds raised as a result of our involvement in the production saloon car championship and our earlier fun days at motor racing circuits. We did some good in less expensive ways too. Anne Nightingale presented her regular W1A1AA show, produced by my old friend Bernie Andrews. He'd dreamed up this name for her request show from our BBC London postcode. Here are selected quotes from one special letter to Annie.
Would you play a beautiful song, What a Friend You Are, for a wonderful guy? I'm a 21-year-old student in Edinburgh and married to a final year medic. In the first week of this year, I discovered I had terminal cancer. We've only been married since last summer, and we had lots of starry-eyed plans before this happened. He's been my tower of strength, taught me how to love as I'd never dreamed possible. Not only to love another human being, but to love life. Never once since January has he allowed me to feel sorry for myself. If he hadn't been around, I don't believe I'd be in the position to face what is to come in such a peaceful frame of mind. I'll never be able to explain to anybody how much I feel for him or how much I love him. I'd like you to play this song on the 30th of this month, as this is our anniversary, and according to the doctor, I'll either not be around or else in hospital, so I won't be able to put this track on our record player for myself.
We subsequently heard from the husband's sister, who told us that the writer had died the day after she heard her request played. Hearing it had made her last day a very happy one. By doing that, Annie and Bernie performed a true public service and perhaps gave some comfort to other cancer sufferers. In October 75 there was another change at the top. It was announced that Charles McClelland, formerly head of the BBC's Arabic service, was to be the new controller of Radio 1 and 2. I wonder why they made me controller years later. Perhaps they remembered my time in Aden. I'd had some experience of the Arabs, but it was very different from that of Charles. It was clear the people who made the appointment, the BBC Board of Governors, knew very little about Radio 1 and 2 and how they worked, yet they were the people who selected the man who was to be our boss. No wonder our morale was low. Derek Chinnery, my boss, didn't get the job and was naturally pretty disappointed. In fact, he had to wait until 1979 for this promotion, when it was decided to have separate controllers for Radio 1 and 2. Morale fell even lower a few days later when the new managing director of radio, Howard Newby, summoned the Radio 1 management. I can't imagine that Howard was a regular reader of Melody Maker, but somehow it came to his notice that the Melody Maker was carrying a full-page advertisement for the new Mike Oldfield LP and saying you could hear it exclusively on BBC Radio 1. Until this happened, we were delighted that we'd scored an exclusive coup over our commercial rivals, and we were gaining all this free promotion for our programme. Wrong. It seemed we had contravened the BBC policy on advertising, so we must instruct John Peel, in whose programme it had been placed, to remove the offending exclusive. We were furious. A quote from my diary. I feel as if we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. It's impossible to run Radio 1 competitively with idiots like this holding us back at every turn. The record company wasted £4,000 on the advertisement, and we were made to look stupid. To make matters worse, a similar situation arose over another advert which had been taken out to promote a world exclusive of the rock album Peter and the Wolf on Alan Freeman's Rock Show. The story was extensively written up in the popular press, and to try to calm things down, Douglas Muggeridge, in his capacity as Director of Programmes, called a management meeting. Douglas made it clear that the BBC was never going to allow any company to profit from product exposure on BBC programmes. We took on board what he said, but pointed out there was a lack of consistency throughout the BBC, as there were examples where television had got away with it, while we were selected as whipping boys. There was another associated row on television next year, 1976, when BBC TV pulled out of coverage of a motor race, the Race of Champions, because of the amount of advertising on the racing cars. Yet the replacement programme was ice skating, where the edge of the rink was plastered with ads. Subsequently, Durex and John Player were obliged to cover up their logos before the television coverage of F1 racing could be resumed. It was a confused and muddled situation. And I was especially interested in the subject, constantly seeking clarification of what could and couldn't be done. I could see all sorts of possibilities to cut the costs of the Radio 1 Roadshow if I could accept off-air sponsorship by Coca-Cola or some other wealthy company. Charles McClellan started in his new capacity as our new controller in January 76, and on the 5th of January we invited him to lunch with the management teams of Radio 1 and 2. He didn't make a good impression. In the diary I wrote, Charles set a poor example by arriving late in a scruffy shirt with a frayed collar and some gravy stains on his lapels. Derek took a Tim view. Another of those scruffy intellectuals. The whole Radio 1 department met informally at a meeting in March on St. Patrick's Day, and I'm afraid he took a verbal battering from most of those present about the perceived lack of confidence in what we did at his level and above. Charles did his best trying to give us some optimism for the future, but he wasn't very inspirational. Johnny Walker, for whom the grass was always greener on the other side of the fence, decided to pack in working for Radio 1 to seek his fortune in America. To put it mildly, there'd been an ongoing tension between Johnny and some of the management over our music policy ever since he'd arrived from Radio Caroline. Johnny was always a champion of rock music off albums rather than the more commercial singles, and this put him at odds with the daytime policy of Radio 1. He'd been given a certain amount of leeway over his content, but more was never enough for Johnny. Following a holiday in the States where he had appeared on stations in California and New York, he decided he would be happier working there. When he announced this on air, the BBC switchboard would jam with calls from frustrated listeners who begged him not to go. Paul Burnett, who was chosen to take over Johnny's slot, had an uphill job from the off. Johnny wasn't the only one to depart for America. The host of Round Table and his own Saturday morning show, Emperor Roscoe, also packed his bags and went back to California to be at his ailing dad's bedside. Roscoe's departure led to an opening which we filled with Canadian David Kid Jensen, so named because he looked about 14. On May 1976, I was in a position to employ John Wolfert's company, Jam Creative Productions, to make the jingles for Radio 1. John had started his career in radio hanging around the WABC studios in New York, and grew to love the station when it was the #1 pop station in the city. After a while, having left college, he started to work for Bill Meeks at Pam's in Dallas, where the WABC jingles had been made, and as I wrote earlier, where the original Radio 1 jingles were made in 1967. Bill Meeks had financial difficulties, and we had tried a few other companies over the years, but the result weren't a patch on Pam's. When John walked into my office to play me some demo tapes of his company's work, I realised here was something as good, if not better, than Bill Meeks' originals. John understood right from the beginning what we needed, and I soon talked Derek and Charles McClelland into buying his package for Radio 1 and Radio 2. John came over in mid-June and spent a few days working out exactly what we wanted and finalised the contract. Meantime, Noel Edmonds teamed up with James Hunt, Formula One champion, for a Tour of Britain charity race in a sponsored Vauxhall. Lots of press photos outside Broadcasting House front door. Nothing was simple, though, again because of a sponsor's involvement. Marlboro Cigarettes had sold space on James's Formula One car to Capital Radio for the British Grand Prix. Consequently, in 1 week James would be seen driving for Radio 1 and another week later for Capital Radio. I spoke to Peter Hunt, James's brother and manager, to try to resolve the dispute, but he was very much in the hands of Marlboro, as they were the main sponsor, and they weren't well disposed towards the BBC because of its ban on coverage of their tobacco-branded cars during the F1 races. It was all pretty silly, and eventually we and Capital managed to live with it. Noel and James set off on July the 9th. According to Noel, James was in an unhappy frame of mind and not very enthusiastic, and he managed to have their first accident at 2:30 a.m. The car was straightened out by the mechanics, and I spent a couple of hours in the night talking to Noel and James, trying to persuade them to press on to the Donington race circuit. At Donington we had a Roadshow special planned with Dave Lee Travis and Mike Smith, while Chris Barber's band was to play live. There were all sorts of other attractions too, a fun fair and parachutists and so on. The unhappy pair did carry on. Noel was of the opinion that the first accident could have been avoided, but later James was booked by the police for dangerous driving and speeding. Next, a straw bale jumped out and hit the car, and there was a problem with the lights, so eventually they dropped out, and that was the end of that. I wasn't terribly happy, as I knew James had collected a large sum from sponsors for turning up, and I suspect if Noel had been accompanied by a driver with a more professional approach, they might well have finished. Pity really, but it gave us a high profile in the press and on TV, and James went on to win the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch soon afterwards and finished the year in Japan in appalling weather, where he won the title 1976 World Champion. As a byproduct of all these different associations with motor racing, by 1976 we had raised over £40,000 for various deserving causes. As Noel's career developed and he was able to afford it, he discovered another expensive hobby, helicopters. As with everything he did, he took it up in a thoroughly professional way, and after gaining his licence, bought a Jet Ranger with a partner, Jed Hughes, who was a wealthy fruit importer. Noel invited my wife and I, together with Jed and his wife, to dinner at his home near Aylesbury, and he offered to pick us all up at Battersea Heliport. The flight up, with Noel at the controls, was very enjoyable, and I was impressed with the way he handled the radio procedures. On arrival we settled down to a lovely evening, after which we all toddled off to bed in Edmonds Towers. Next morning, up bright and early and feeling a little hungover, we were tucking into a hearty breakfast when Noel broke the news. "I'm sorry I can't fly you back, as I have to do a photo shoot here for the cover of the Radio Times, so Jed is going to fly you back to Battersea." I had no idea of Jed's capabilities, but was somewhat alarmed when, after take-off, Jed asked me, "Here, John, you any good with the maps? If not, I'll get the wife to do it." As we flew out, he called air traffic. "Hello, can you give me a bearing for Heathrow?" "Oh, lost again, are we, Mr. Hughes?" No, not really. It's a bit misty up here. Give me a bearing and I'll follow the railway line." And so it went on for the next half hour or so until we reached Battersea. I knew enough about it to be really scared, as I knew we had to cross the Heathrow approach, some of the busiest skies in the world. On landing I had a coffee and a large brandy to steady my nerves. I called Noel. "Don't you ever put me in a helicopter with Jed Hughes again. He may be your business partner, but he certainly isn't in the same class as you as a pilot." Episodes like this did nothing for my stress level. I felt I was driving a juggernaut which was in danger of going out of control. Apart from my having my hands full with fun days, I still had to manage the daily programmes and the producers in my area, as well as set up the Roadshow, now in its third year. And on top of all this, I was busy making a cinema film about the Roadshow. There were stories going round about Noel having marriage problems with Jill, his wife, which we needed to keep out of the press. And if I didn't spend more time at home, I too was going to be suffering in that direction. There was the occasional opportunity for relaxation. On September the 16th, I was invited for lunch with Richard Branson and his record company partner Simon Draper at their houseboat in Little Venice. Richard was quiet and unassuming. He explained his background, his dad being a magistrate, and how he started Virgin by importing records from the continent, while Simon was the one who obviously loved music. Their skills complemented each other perfectly, which is why Virgin Records went on to be so successful. September the 16th, I had an interesting lunch with Geoffrey Johnson Smith, the Tory politician, who I'd met through John Webb at the British Grand Prix. Another quote from my diary. It appears he has a consultancy arrangement with Brands Hatch parent company to act as a political advisor. He's been lobbying the BBC Director General about the BBC's boycott of motorsport on TV. Not that I think he will make much progress while the current attitudes to advertising prevail. Geoffrey is a very pleasant man, a good host, a typical politician who makes a point of remembering the names of everyone's wife. He's going to keep his ear to the ground about any leaks from the forthcoming Annan report on the future of broadcasting. He's obviously close to Douglas Muggeridge, as his children keep their horses stabled at Douglas's house. Back at the BBC, we spent hours debating what would be the relative roles of Radio 1 and 2 when we achieved more separation. I argued strongly that in the best traditions of the BBC, the two networks should be offering complementary radio services regardless of the size of the audience. Radio 2 had moved noticeably to the left, including less light music and more middle-of-the-road pop. Derek complained there was little or no direction from our controller Charles, so as we were at the moment, there was a considerable overlap in the music, and we were in direct competition with Radio 2 for listeners. Charles, the controller, came to another departmental meeting in November, but was still unable to give us any assurance about the restoration of the cuts. It was a pretty depressing time.